Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The Unseen Spectre of Slumber, a Descent into Paralysis. The year was 2018. The Australian sun, a fiery orb in the vast expanse of the sky, beat down upon me with an intensity one hadn't felt in years. I, Victoria, had just returned to my native land, trading the concrete canyons of America for the familiar embrace of the Australian coast. It was a homecoming tinged with a bittersweet melancholy. The excitement of returning was tempered by the circumstances that had precipitated my move, a series of life-altering events that had left me feeling adrift, searching for a semblance of stability. My sanctuary, for the time being, was anything but luxurious. I found myself residing in a temporary dwelling, my nights spent on an inflatable mattress that possessed all the comfort of a bed of rocks. It was a constant, irritating reminder of my transient state, a physical manifestation of the uncertainty that permeated my life. The air mattress itself seemed to exude an aura of unease. Its plastic surface was perpetually cold, and every slight shift in my weight produced a cacophony of squeaks and groans. The pale blue color, meant to evoke a sense of serenity, instead served to highlight the mattress's inherent cheapness. It was a far cry from the plush, comforting beds I had known, a symbol of the upheaval that had become my new normal. It was on this wretched, inflatable island that I would have my first, terrifying encounter with the phenomenon known as sleep paralysis. The evening had been unremarkable. I had unpacked a few more boxes, attempting to impose some order on the chaos of my belongings. The air hung heavy with the scent of eucalyptus and the distant, rhythmic roar of the ocean. I remember feeling a profound sense of loneliness, a yearning for the familiar comforts of my former life. As darkness crept in, I retreated to my inflatable exile, seeking solace in sleep. The awakening was abrupt, disorienting. My eyes snapped open, yet my body remained stubbornly unresponsive. It was as if an invisible force held me captive, pinning me to the unforgiving surface of the mattress. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at the edges of my awareness. I tried to move, to sit up, to even twitch a finger, but my muscles refused to obey. The simple act of raising my head, something I had taken for granted my entire life, became an insurmountable obstacle. As I struggled against this unseen restraint, my vision began to deteriorate. The room, dimly lit by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains, started to fade. A swirling vortex of blackness, like an encroaching abyss, threatened to consume my sight. It was a terrifying sensation, this loss of control, this descent into darkness. Yet, even through the encroaching blackness, I could still perceive, in a distorted, fragmented way, the outlines of my surroundings. The familiar shape of a suitcase, the silhouette of a chair, the faint glimmer of the moon on the window pane. These fragments of reality anchored me, preventing me from being completely swallowed by the encroaching void. This was my first conscious encounter with sleep paralysis. I had read about it, of course. Snippets of articles, whispered conversations, chilling accounts shared online. They had all painted a picture of a terrifying, otherworldly experience. The stories spoke of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of rooms, of malevolent entities pressing down on helpless victims, of the utter, agonizing inability to move or scream. These tales, once distant and abstract, now flooded my consciousness with a visceral, palpable fear. My mind raced. Was this just the beginning? Would the paralysis deepen? The darkness intensify? Would I become another statistic? Another victim added to the growing list of those who had endured the unspeakable horrors of sleep paralysis? The thought of encountering one of those legendary shadow people, those malevolent entities said to haunt the sleep paralyzed, sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. I focused on my breathing, trying to regulate the frantic rhythm of my heart. I told myself repeatedly that this was temporary, that it would pass, that I was safe. But the rational part of my brain was losing the battle against the primal fear that gripped me. My body felt heavy, leaden, as if weighed down by an invisible force. I imagined myself sinking, drowning in the suffocating darkness, a helpless victim of this unseen tormentor. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The paralysis released its icy grip, and I jolted upright, gasping for air. My heart continued to pound, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my limbs trembled with the aftershocks of the experience. The relief was immense, profound, but it was tainted by a lingering fear, a shadow that clung to me like a second skin. I sat there, on that ridiculous inflatable mattress, in the dim, silent room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real, or was it just a particularly vivid nightmare, a product of my stressed and exhausted mind? The rational part of me wanted to believe the latter, but the visceral terror I had felt, the utter helplessness, the encroaching darkness, it all felt too real, too immediate, to be dismissed as a mere dream. I considered myself lucky, incredibly lucky, to have escaped relatively unscathed. This first encounter had been brief, a fleeting glimpse into the abyss, but it had left an indelible mark, a deep-seated fear that would linger for years to come. It was a fear born not just of the experience itself, but of the unknown, of the potential for future encounters, of the possibility that the next time I might not be so fortunate. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was not the last time I would face the unseen specter of slumber. The inflatable mattress, once a symbol of my temporary displacement, now felt like a cursed object, a gateway to a realm of terror I desperately wanted to avoid. The night stretched before me, long and ominous, and I knew that sleep would be a long time coming. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of the moonlight, listening to the distant roar of the ocean, a constant reminder of the vastness and the mystery of the world, a world where such terrifying phenomena as sleep paralysis could exist, waiting to claim unsuspecting victims in the dead of night. My vow was solidified, carved into the very fabric of my being. I would do whatever it took to never, ever experience that again. But deep down, a nagging voice whispered that I might not have a choice in the matter. The silent watcher by the stream, an unseen presence. The year 2020 unfolded like a dystopian novel, a relentless barrage of global anxieties and uncertainties. While the world grappled with a pandemic that redefined the very fabric of existence, I, Julian, was wrestling with a personal terror that, in its own way, felt just as apocalyptic. It began, as these things often do, with an awakening, but this was no ordinary return to consciousness. It was a chilling plunge into the abyss of utter helplessness. The morning sun, a pale imitation of its usual vibrant self, filtered weakly through the curtains of my bedroom window. I awoke to a stillness that was both profound and unsettling. My eyes flickered open, taking in the familiar surroundings of my room, yet my body remained stubbornly unresponsive. It was as if an invisible force field had enveloped me, rendering me completely immobile. Unlike my previous encounter with sleep paralysis, there was no struggle, no initial fight against the unseen restraint. This time, the paralysis was absolute, instantaneous, and utterly terrifying. My previous experience, though frightening, had been relatively brief. I had managed to break free with a surge of adrenaline and willpower. But this was different. This felt like a complete and irreversible shutdown. My body, my own physical form, had become a prison, a cage from which there seemed to be no escape. The sensation was akin to being encased in concrete, every muscle, every nerve, every fiber of my being locked in a state of agonizing immobility. The room itself seemed to amplify the horror. The familiar objects, the bedside table, the cluttered bookshelf, the clothes draped carelessly over a chair, took on a sinister aspect, their mundane presence somehow mocking my helplessness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of my heart, a desperate drumbeat against the suffocating stillness. My mind, however, was far from still. It raced with a singular, all-consuming fear, a primal dread that clawed at the edges of my consciousness. The tales of shadowy figures, the malevolent entities often reported in sleep paralysis experiences, flooded my thoughts. I had read countless accounts, dismissed them as mere folklore, the product of overactive imaginations. But now, trapped in this state of utter vulnerability, those stories took on a chilling new reality. Please, I thought, the silent plea echoing in the confines of my paralyzed mind. Let there be no shadow with this. The image of a shadowy figure, a dark, formless presence lurking in the corner of my room, filled me with a terror so profound it threatened to overwhelm me. It was a fear that transcended the rational, a deep-seated dread that tapped into the most ancient, instinctive parts of my being. I strained against the invisible bonds, desperately trying to move, to speak, to break the suffocating silence that enveloped me. I focused all my energy on my vocal cords, willing them to respond, to produce even the faintest sound. But my voice was trapped, my throat constricted, my efforts futile. All that escaped my lips were pathetic, guttural groans, barely audible whimpers that were swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the room. They were the sounds of a trapped animal, a desperate, hopeless cry for help that would never be heard. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Each second was an agonizing torment, a battle between the desperate hope for release and the growing dread of what further horrors this paralysis might bring. I fixated on the fear of seeing a shadowy figure, an apparition, a manifestation of my deepest anxieties materialize before me. It was a fear that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to consume me entirely. I imagined it slowly emerging from the shadows, its form indistinct at first, then gradually solidifying, taking on a shape that would forever haunt my nightmares. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything other than the impending doom I felt. I concentrated on the faint patterns of light filtering through the curtains, on the texture of the sheets beneath my paralyzed body, on the distant sounds of birds chirping outside my window. But these attempts were feeble, easily overwhelmed by the crushing weight of my fear. The thought of my family, of my friends, of the life I had lived, flashed through my mind. Was this it? Was this how it would end? Trapped in this silent, immobile prison, a victim of some unknown, unseen force? The thought was unbearable, and I fought against it with all the strength I could muster, clinging to the hope that this nightmare would eventually end. I focused on the memory of my mother's smile, the sound of my father's laughter, the warmth of a friend's embrace. These memories, fragments of a life that felt so distant at that moment, became my lifeline, my anchor in the storm of terror that raged within me. Then, with a suddenness that startled me, the paralysis broke. It was as if a switch had been flipped, the invisible bonds instantly released. I gasped for air, my lungs filling with the sweet, life-giving oxygen that had been denied to me for what felt like an eternity. My body trembled, every muscle twitching with the aftershocks of the experience. The relief was immense, a tidal wave of liberation washing over me, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I sat up in bed, my heart still racing, my body drenched in a cold sweat. The room, once a scene of unimaginable terror, now seemed almost ordinary. The sunlight filtering through the curtains was no longer weak and pale, but bright and welcoming. The silence was no longer oppressive, but peaceful, broken only by the gentle sounds of the waking world. But the memory of the experience lingered, a dark stain on the fabric of my reality. The groans, my futile attempts to break free, echoed in my mind, a stark reminder of my utter vulnerability. This encounter had reinforced my silent vow, a vow made after my first brush with sleep paralysis. I would do everything in my power to avoid a recurrence. I started researching methods, lifestyle changes, anything that might help me prevent this from happening again. I changed my sleep schedule, avoided caffeine and alcohol before bed, and practiced relaxation techniques. I even considered seeing a sleep specialist, but the fear of reliving the experience during a sleep study was too great. This second encounter had been far more intense, far more terrifying than the first. It had left me shaken to my core, questioning the very nature of reality, the boundaries between the waking world and the realm of dreams. The fear of the shadow people, once a distant, abstract concept, had become a palpable, visceral dread. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this would not be the last time I faced the silent watcher by the stream, the unseen presence that lurked in the shadows of my sleep. The world, once a place of relative safety and predictability, now felt full of hidden dangers, of unseen forces waiting to prey on the vulnerable. And I, Julian, was undeniably vulnerable. The experience had stripped me of my illusions of control, leaving me exposed and afraid, a prisoner of my own subconscious fears. The ghosts of Gumball Grove, a childhood unveiled. The year was 2021. I, Amelia, found myself amidst a period of intense academic pressure. University exams loomed, casting a long, stressful shadow over my life. The weight of impending deadlines, the relentless pursuit of knowledge, and the fear of failure created a constant, low-level hum of anxiety that permeated my waking hours. It was a pressure cooker, and I, like many of my peers, was feeling the heat. Perhaps, I reasoned later, this sustained stress was a contributing factor, a crack in the dam of my subconscious that allowed the unsettling events that followed to seep through. Or perhaps, as some might suggest, there are forces at play in this world that defy rational explanation, forces that operate beyond the realm of logic and reason. The dream began, as dreams often do, in a place both familiar and unsettlingly alien. I found myself in a house, a structure that bore an uncanny resemblance to the animated residence from the children's television show, The Amazing World of Gumball. This seemingly innocuous detail, this connection to a cartoon world of whimsy and absurdity, would later strike me as profoundly strange, a bizarre juxtaposition against the terror that was to unfold. It was a detail I would recount to others, often met with puzzled expressions and polite smiles, a testament to the inherent strangeness of the dreamscape. The house, in its dream-rendered form, possessed a peculiar quality, felt both real and unreal, solid and ethereal. The walls seemed to breathe, the colors were both vibrant and muted, and the air hung heavy with a sense of waiting. It was a waiting that hummed with an undercurrent of unease, a subtle premonition of something unknown, something lurking just beyond the periphery of my awareness. I found myself in what appeared to be the living room, a space cluttered with the typical accoutrements of family life. Furniture, lamps, and, most notably, a collection of photographs adorning the walls. These were not the generic, stock photos one might find in a staged home, but images that resonated with a deep personal significance. They were photographs of my family, group portraits, candid snapshots, individual portraits, a visual tapestry of my own history, scattered across the walls like fragments of a shattered mirror. I approached the wall, drawn by an irresistible curiosity, a need to connect with these familiar faces, to anchor myself in this strange, unsettling environment. I scanned the images, recognizing loved ones, tracing the outlines of faces etched in my memory. My parents, my siblings, my grandparents, they were all there, frozen in time, smiling back at me from their two-dimensional world. It was a comforting sight, a momentary reprieve from the underlying unease that permeated the dream. And then I saw her. It was a standalone photograph, smaller than the others, tucked away in a corner as if deliberately hidden. The image depicted a woman, seemingly in her 30s, dressed in a flowing white gown reminiscent of the Victorian era. The dress was anachronistic, out of place amidst the modern setting of the dream house, adding another layer of surrealism to the experience. Her hair was dark, cascading down her shoulders in gentle waves, framing a face that was both beautiful and unsettling. But it was her eyes that captivated me, that held me captive in their gaze. They were dark, piercing, and seemed to penetrate my very soul. There was an intensity to her stare, a knowingness that sent a shiver of unease down my spine. It was the look of someone who knew a secret that she was not willing to share. It was a look that spoke of a world beyond my comprehension, a world of shadows and whispers, a world that I was not sure I wanted to enter. The unsettling nature of the photograph was amplified by the fact that I did not recognize her. She was a stranger, an intruder in this otherwise familiar gallery of faces. I searched my memory, desperately trying to place her, to connect her to some distant relative, some forgotten family friend. But there was nothing. She remained an enigma, a figure out of time, a ghost in the machine of my family history. The unease I had felt since entering the dream house now intensified, morphing into a palpable sense of dread. I felt a primal urge to flee, to escape the penetrating gaze of this unknown woman. As if in response to my unspoken fear, I turned my head, slowly, deliberately, to the left. And there she was, standing in the living room. A mere few feet away was the woman from the photograph. She was no longer a two-dimensional image, but a living, breathing presence. Her Victorian dress starkly contrasting with the modern furnishings of the room. She was facing away from me, her body still, her presence radiating an aura of quiet menace. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the dream. I wanted to scream, to shout, to break the spell that held me captive. But my voice was trapped, my vocal cords paralyzed by fear. I could only stand there, frozen in place, watching as this enigmatic figure slowly, deliberately, began to turn her head. It was a movement that defied the laws of physics, a grotesque contortion of the human form. Her face snapped sideways, her neck twisting at an impossible angle, her eyes locking onto mine. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror, a moment that would forever be etched in the deepest recesses of my memory. The woman's eyes, once merely unsettling in the photograph, were now filled with a malevolent intensity, a chilling awareness that sent shivers down my spine. And then I awoke. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding, my body drenched in a cold sweat. The room was dark, the only light filtering through the gap in the curtains. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic rhythm of my own breathing. I lay there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it just a dream? A particularly vivid nightmare fueled by the stress of my upcoming exams? Or was it something more? The memory of the woman, her Victorian dress, her piercing gaze, the impossible twist of her neck. It all felt too real, too visceral, to be dismissed as a mere figment of my imagination. And then, the true horror dawned on me. I was not alone. I glanced to my side, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. And there, standing at the foot of my bed, was the woman from the dream. She was no longer a figure in a photograph, no longer a figment of my imagination. She was real, tangible, her presence filling the room with an icy dread. Words cannot adequately describe the terror I felt at that moment. It was a fear that transcended the rational, a primal, instinctive response to something utterly alien, something that defied the laws of nature. I tried to scream, to shout, to call for help, but, as in the dream, my voice was trapped, my vocal cords paralyzed. All that escaped my lips was a strangled groan, a pathetic whimper lost in the silence of the room. The woman began to move, slowly, deliberately, gliding towards me with an unnatural grace. She was not walking, but floating, her feet barely seeming to touch the floor. As she approached, she knelt down, her face level with mine, her eyes burning into my soul. A cruel, mocking smile played on her lips, and she raised a finger to her mouth, as if to silence my desperate, unspoken pleas for help. It was a gesture of both dominance and mockery, a silent acknowledgement of my utter helplessness. And then, as if the scene wasn't already terrifying enough, I became aware of other presences in the room. I glanced towards the ceiling, and there, swirling in and out of the plaster, were multiple, glowing apparitions, their forms indistinct, their intentions unknown. They were like wisps of smoke, ethereal beings, their presence adding another layer of surreal horror to the unfolding nightmare. The woman, still kneeling beside my bed, began to speak, her voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to penetrate my very being. Next time, she repeated over and over. Her words a chilling promise, a threat that hung heavy in the air. Next time, next time. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The woman vanished, the apparitions faded, and I was finally able to move. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I had never been more grateful to be awake, to be free from the clutches of that terrifying nightmare. The aftermath of that experience was profound. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the sense of having encountered something truly evil, something that defied rational explanation. I tried to analyze the dream, to dissect it, to find some logical explanation for what had happened. Was it a manifestation of my stress? A product of my overactive imagination? Or was it something more? I searched through old family photos, desperately trying to find the woman, to identify her, to connect her to some forgotten relative. But there was nothing. She remained an enigma, a ghost in the machine of my family history, a figure that haunted my waking thoughts and invaded my dreams. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, a fear of the unknown, a fear of the darkness that lurked just beyond the periphery of my awareness. I hoped with all my heart that there would never be a next time, that I would never again have to face the chilling presence of the woman from the dream. But deep down, a nagging voice whispered that I might not have a choice in the matter. The memory of her face, her eyes, her smile, and her whispered threat would remain with me, a constant reminder of the night I encountered the ghosts of Gumball Grove, the Whispering Pines Trail. I should have known better than to veer off the marked path. But the lure of a secret vista promised by a group of seemingly friendly locals was too strong to resist. After weeks spent wrestling with a brutal heartbreak and the soul-crushing termination of my employment, the Appalachian Trail had been my sanctuary, my refuge. 3 days into the solo hike, my muscles screamed in protest, and the weight of my backpack seemed to increase exponentially with each passing mile. But finally, my mind had begun to quiet. The constant drone of self-doubt and recrimination was fading, replaced by the hypnotic rhythm of my boots on the leaf-strewn trail and the sighing of the wind through the ancient pines. I was a woman reborn, or so I thought. I was pausing at a trail junction, double-checking my position on a slightly crumpled map, when the voices reached me. A merry, almost boisterous sound. It shattered the tranquil silence. Moments later, for figures rounded the bend, 2 men and 2 women, their laughter echoing through the trees as if they were old friends enjoying a casual weekend stroll. They looked the part of seasoned locals. Faded flannel shirts, well-worn denim jeans, and hiking boots that had clearly seen countless miles. The eldest of the group, a man with a neatly trimmed beard, silver threading through his dark hair, and deep lines etched around his eyes, offered me a warm, crinkled smile and a friendly wave. "Howdy there, hiker," he called out, his voice carrying a soft, almost musical Appalachian drawl. "Tackling the on your own, are you?" I nodded, suddenly acutely aware of how long it had been since I'd engaged in actual human conversation. "Yes," I replied, my voice sounding a little rusty to my own ears. "Just me and the wilderness." The man introduced himself as Declan, and then quickly introduced the others. Micah, Abigail, and Willow. They inquired about my journey, my origin, the typical, inconsequential small talk one engages in with strangers. It felt strangely comforting, even normal, to be interacting with other people again. To speak, to be heard. Declan leaned in, adopting a conspiratorial tone, as if sharing a precious secret. "You know," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "if you're after a truly spectacular view, we know a place, a hidden overlook just off the trail. Most hikers miss it completely, 'cause it ain't marked on any of the maps." My internal alarm bells began to chime, a quiet but insistent warning. Every ounce of common sense, every survival instinct screamed at me to stick to the designated trail, to not follow strangers into the deepening woods, especially strangers met in the wilderness. But they appeared so genuine, so utterly sincere in their desire to share this hidden gem, this unspoiled vista. And weren't these unexpected detours, these unplanned discoveries, the very essence of what drew people to wilderness adventures? "It's not that far," Abigail interjected, her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, sparkling with what I perceived as genuine enthusiasm. "Half an hour, maybe at the very most. And the panorama of the valley is simply breathtaking, especially at this time of year, with the leaves turning all those glorious shades of gold and crimson." My resolve, weakened by days of solitude and the alluring promise of something extraordinary, crumbled. "Sure," I found myself saying, the words escaping my lips before I could fully process the implications. "Why not? Lead the way." We set off, leaving the well-trodden, familiar path behind. Declan took the lead, his confident stride belying his age. Micah, silent and watchful, brought up the rear. Abigail and Willow, flanking me like gentle shepherds, filled the air with light-hearted chatter about the local history, pointing out various plants and sharing snippets of regional folklore. At first, we followed a faint, almost indiscernible trail, little more than a deer path. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, even that faded trace disappeared. The forest grew denser, the canopy overhead, a thick, interwoven tapestry of leaves, progressively blocking out the sunlight. The cheerful banter of the group gradually subsided, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of our footsteps and the occasional, unnerving snap of a twig underfoot. I tried, desperately, to keep track of our meandering route, to memorize landmarks, but the trees, once distinct and individual, began to blur into an indistinguishable mass, and my internal compass spun uselessly. A knot of unease, cold and hard, formed in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't right. The promised half-hour passed, and then another, and still we pressed onward. The terrain became steeper, more challenging. The underbrush grew thicker, clawing at my clothing and impeding my progress. My legs burned with the relentless exertion, and I was forced to use my hands to push aside branches that seemed to reach out, almost malevolently, to snag me. "How much further?" I asked, striving to keep the tremor of anxiety out of my voice. Declan glanced back at me, his earlier warmth replaced by a cool, assessing gaze. "Not far now," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the earlier jovial tone. "You're not getting tired, are you?" There was something in his intonation, a subtle hint of mockery, perhaps, or something even more sinister, that sent a shiver of apprehension down my spine. I forced a smile, a weak, unconvincing grimace. "No," I lied, "just curious." We continued our trek in silence, a heavy, suffocating silence punctuated only by the rustling of leaves and my increasingly labored breathing. I now noticed, with a growing sense of dread, that the others had subtly shifted their positions, forming a loose, almost imperceptible circle around me. Each time I slowed my pace, or attempted to subtly alter my direction, one of them was there, an unobtrusive presence, gently but firmly herding me back onto their chosen course. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was being corralled, like an animal. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I tried to calm myself, to rationalize the situation. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe this secret vista really was just a little further. But as we entered a small, unremarkable clearing, devoid of any scenic view, I knew with a sickening certainty that I had made a terrible, potentially fatal mistake. There was no breathtaking panorama, no sweeping valley spread out before us, just a small, enclosed space, surrounded by dense, impenetrable forest. Declan stopped, turning to face me. The others closed ranks, forming a tight, inescapable circle. "Well," Declan said, his voice now devoid of any pretense of friendliness, his words laced with a chilling, predatory calm. "Looks like we made it." I spun around, desperately searching for an opening, a gap in their human wall, any avenue of escape. But there was none. They had positioned themselves perfectly, blocking off any possible route of flight. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my desperate attempt to sound strong, to project an authority I did not feel. "Where's the view you promised?" Micah, who had remained almost entirely silent throughout our trek, let out a low, guttural chuckle. "Oh, there's a view, all right," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Just not the kind you were expecting." Abigail stepped closer, her once sparkling eyes now gleaming with a cold, predatory light. "You really shouldn't have come with us," she said, her voice dripping with a false, chilling sympathy. "But then again, they never learn, do they?" My mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the unfolding nightmare. Who were these people? What did they want? The weight of my backpack suddenly felt suffocating, and with a convulsive movement, I shrugged it off, letting it fall to the ground with a thud. I was ready to run, to fight, if I saw even the slightest opportunity. "Listen," I said, striving to keep my voice level, to project an air of calm I was far from feeling. "I don't know what's going on here, but I don't want any trouble. Just let me go, and I'll forget this ever happened." Declan advanced, closing the distance between us until I could smell his breath. A strange, unsettling combination of stale coffee and something metallic, something vaguely nauseating. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice low and menacing, a predatory purr. "Trouble found you the moment you stepped off that trail." In that instant, I knew I had two choices: act or die. Fueled by a surge of pure, primal adrenaline, I swung my backpack with all my strength, catching Declan squarely in the chest. He staggered backward, surprise momentarily eclipsing the smug, predatory look on his face. I didn't wait to see their reaction. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of direction, of noise, of anything except the desperate need to put as much distance as possible between myself and those people. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging welts. Roots, hidden beneath the thick carpet of leaves, snagged at my feet, threatening to send me sprawling. But I kept moving, driven by the raw, visceral instinct of survival. Behind me, I could hear shouts, the sounds of pursuit. They knew these woods intimately. They had the advantage of numbers, of familiarity. But I had the desperate, unyielding energy of someone fighting for their very life. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like lead weights, until my muscles screamed in protest. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but I didn't dare stop. The forest, an endless, indistinguishable maze of trees and undergrowth, offered no solace, no landmarks, no sign of the trail or of any human habitation. As the initial surge of adrenaline began to wane, panic, cold and suffocating, set in. I was lost, utterly and completely lost, alone in an unfamiliar wilderness, with no supplies, no sense of direction, and no idea which way led to safety. For all I knew, I was running deeper into their territory. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock my desperate plight. The forest grew darker, more menacing, with each passing minute. I knew I couldn't keep running blindly. I needed to find shelter, a place to hide, to catch my breath, to think. A fallen tree, massive and ancient, caught my eye. Its upturned roots and the hollow beneath its trunk created a natural, albeit precarious, shelter. I crawled into the space, pressing myself as far back as I could, the earthy smell of decaying leaves filling my nostrils. I tried to quiet my ragged breathing, to control the tremors that racked my body. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl sent a fresh wave of terror through me. As full darkness descended, the forest came alive with the sounds of the night, the hooting of owls, the scurrying of small animals, the rustling of leaves. But underlying it all was a tense, expectant silence, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I don't know how long I huddled there, shivering from cold and fear, my mind conjuring terrifying images of Declan and his group finding me, dragging me out of my hiding place. What would they do to me? Why had they lured me out here? At some point, exhaustion, born of fear and exertion, must have overtaken me, because the next thing I remember is jolting awake to the sound of voices. Distant at first, but growing steadily closer. I held my breath, pressing myself further into the concealing darkness of my makeshift shelter. She couldn't have gotten far. I heard Declan's voice, chillingly close. Fan out and keep looking. She's got to be around here somewhere. Footsteps crunched through the leaves, pausing every so often. I could hear them searching, calling out to each other, their voices echoing through the night. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loudly I was certain they would hear it. A beam of light swept over my hiding place, and I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to become invisible, to merge with the shadows. The footsteps came closer, leaves crunching just inches from where I lay. "Hey, Declan," Micah's voice called out. "I think I found something over here." The footsteps moved away, and I allowed myself to breathe again, a shallow, ragged gasp. But I knew I couldn't stay here. It was only a matter of time before they found me. As their voices grew more distant, I steeled myself for what I had to do. I had to move. I had to find my way out of these woods before they circled back. Crawling out from my hiding place, I tried to orient myself as best I could in the darkness. The moon, a sliver in the inky sky, provided just enough light to make out shapes, but not much more. I picked a direction arbitrarily and started moving, trying to be as silent as possible, to leave no trace of my passage. Every step was a torment. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, but I pressed on, driven by the primal instinct to survive, by the knowledge that staying still meant certain capture. I don't know how long I walked or how far. Time had lost all meaning in the dark, oppressive forest. But eventually, miraculously, I saw a faint glow through the trees. Civilization. Stumbling out onto a road, I flagged down the first car I saw. The elderly couple inside looked shocked, understandably, at my appearance, scratched, dirty, and wild-eyed. But they took me to the nearest police station, where I poured out my story, my words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. The police searched the area extensively, but found no trace of Declan or his group. No evidence of the clearing where they had trapped me. It was as if they had vanished, swallowed by the forest itself. I never went back to finish my hike. The Appalachian Trail, once a source of solace and escape, now featured prominently in my nightmares. But sometimes, on dark nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I wonder about those woods. And I shudder knowing that somewhere out there, Declan and his group are probably looking for their next unsuspecting hiker, ready to lure them away from the safety of the marked trail into the dark heart of the Whispering Pines. The silent retreat. The silence was supposed to be a sanctuary, a balm for my frayed nerves. Instead, it became a breeding ground for terror. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of leaves outside the window, amplified 1,000-fold in the unnerving quiet. What began as a solo weekend getaway to a remote cabin, a desperate attempt to escape the relentless pressures of city life, spiraled into a nightmare that continues to haunt my waking hours, leaving me questioning the very nature of solitude and the unseen forces that may lurk just beyond the edges of our perception. Months of relentless deadlines, the incessant drone of traffic, and the suffocating weight of expectations had ground me down to a raw, exposed nerve. I felt like a tightly wound spring on the verge of snapping. Then, I stumbled upon the listing for the Havenwood Retreat, a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods, promising absolute tranquility and complete digital detox. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me, the wilderness, and the promise of a much-needed reset. It seemed like the perfect antidote to my urban malaise. The drive up was idyllic, a visual feast of winding roads, dense forests painted in the vibrant hues of early autumn, and sparkling streams that gurgled and whispered secrets to the passing wind. As I turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the cabin, the trees seemed to close in around me, forming a natural, cathedral-like archway that ushered me into my weekend sanctuary. The cabin itself was a picture of rustic charm. A small, weathered wooden structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney, looking for all the world like something plucked from the pages of a fairy tale. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and took a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp, pine-scented air. Already, I could feel the tension in my shoulders beginning to ease, the knot in my stomach loosening. The interior was cozy and well-maintained, if somewhat Spartan. A large, stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a compact kitchenette tucked into a corner. The bedroom was snug, with a single window offering a breathtaking view of the surrounding forest. It wasn't luxurious, but it was precisely what I needed. Simplicity, solitude, and a complete disconnection from the digital world. I spent the afternoon settling in, unpacking my meager provisions, and exploring the immediate surroundings. There was a small clearing behind the cabin, perfect for stargazing, and a well-worn path that led down to a crystal-clear creek. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I built a fire in the fireplace, poured myself a glass of wine, and curled up in an armchair with a well-worn copy of Walden. The silence was profound, not the muffled quiet of a city apartment, where the sounds of traffic and sirens are ever present, but a deep, resonant silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I reveled in it, feeling the last vestiges of city stress melting away like snow in the spring sun. It was close to midnight when I finally decided to retire for the night. I banked the fire, made sure the doors were locked more out of habit than any real sense of threat, and climbed into bed. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, and I drifted off almost immediately, lulled by the absolute, enveloping quiet. I'm not entirely sure what woke me. Perhaps it was a sound, a subtle shift in the air, or simply that inexplicable primal sense of unease that something was wrong. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding against my ribs, my senses on high alert. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the silence, heavy and expectant. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. My initial thought was that it must be an animal, a deer, perhaps, or a raccoon foraging for scraps around the cabin. But as I listened, the footsteps seemed too deliberate, too measured to be those of a wild creature. They circled the cabin, slowly, methodically, pausing occasionally before continuing their unsettling circuit. I slid out of bed, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Moving to the window, I peered out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the clearing, but I couldn't see anyone or anything. The footsteps continued, now on the far side of the cabin, their rhythmic crunching a stark counterpoint to the otherwise silent night. A chill, sharp and visceral, ran down my spine. Who or what would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? The isolation that had seemed so appealing just hours before now felt oppressive, menacing. I crept into the main room, checking the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure, just as I had left it. The footsteps completed their circuit of the cabin and then, abruptly, ceased. I stood there in the darkness, barely breathing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nothing did, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a matter of minutes. I let out a shaky laugh, a nervous release of tension, and chastised myself for my paranoia. I went back to bed, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of leaves outside the window was magnified 1,000-fold, fueling my lingering unease. Morning arrived, bright and clear, banishing the shadows of the night. I awoke feeling surprisingly refreshed, despite my restless sleep. The unsettling events of the previous night now seemed distant, like fragments of a fading nightmare. I made coffee, deciding to enjoy it on the porch, soaking in the beauty of the surrounding forest. As I stepped outside, my mug slipped from my grasp, shattering on the wooden planks. There, in the center of the clearing, was a small, meticulously constructed pile of rocks. 5 or 6 stones, carefully stacked on top of each other. It hadn't been there the previous day. I was absolutely certain of it. My mind raced. Had someone been here while I slept? But why leave a pile of rocks? It seemed so pointless, so utterly bizarre. I approached it cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at me, but it was just rocks. Cold, inert, and utterly inexplicable. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the growing sense of unease that had settled over me like a shroud. I hiked down to the creek, splashed my face in the icy water, and even managed to spot a family of deer grazing in a distant meadow. By the time evening approached, I had almost convinced myself that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the rock pile. Maybe the property owner, whose name was Elias, had stopped by to check on things and, for some inexplicable reason, decided to indulge in some impromptu rock stacking. As darkness fell, however, the tension returned, amplified by the memory of the previous night's unsettling sounds. Every creak of the cabin settling, every rustle of leaves outside, seemed to carry a hidden threat. I built another fire, hoping its warm glow would dispel the shadows that seemed to lurk in every corner. I must have dozed off in the armchair, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to the sound of knocking. 3 sharp, insistent raps on the front door, clear and unmistakable. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. "Hello," I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Who's there?" No answer, just silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. The knocking came again, this time from the back door. I whirled around, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. I lunged for my phone, forgetting for a moment that there was no service out here. My hands shook as I tried to dial 911 anyway, praying for a miracle. Nothing. The screen mockingly displayed no signal. Another series of knocks echoed through the cabin, this time from the bedroom window. Panic, raw and overwhelming, seized me. I grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it out in front of me like a makeshift weapon. "I'm armed," I shouted, trying to project an air of bravado I was far from feeling. "Leave me alone." The knocking stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was no sound but my own ragged breathing. Then, softly at first, but growing louder, I heard laughter. It seemed to come from all around the cabin, a chorus of mocking, inhuman chuckles that made my blood run cold. I backed into a corner, the poker clutched tightly in my hand, and waited. The laughter faded, replaced once again by that awful, suffocating silence. I don't know how long I stood there, every muscle tense, expecting at any moment for the doors to burst open, for someone to come crashing in. But nothing happened. As the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. Whatever had been out there, it seemed to have gone. Exhausted and terrified, I waited until the sun was fully up before venturing outside. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. Surrounding the cabin, spaced evenly about 10 feet apart, were more of those rock piles. Dozens of them, each one identical to the one I had found the previous morning. I didn't bother packing. I just grabbed my keys and ran for my car. As I sped down the gravel driveway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I drove straight to the local police station, my story tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed jumble. They were kind but skeptical. They took my statement and promised to check out the cabin, but I could see in their eyes that they didn't really believe me. When they called a few days later, their report was frustratingly mundane. They had found no evidence of intruders, no footprints, and no rock piles. The cabin was exactly as it should be. Peaceful, undisturbed, and utterly empty. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was stress, or an overactive imagination fueled by too many horror movies. But in my heart, I know what I experienced was real. Something was out there in those woods, something that toyed with me for reasons I'll never understand. I've never returned to that cabin or any cabin, for that matter. The peace and solitude I once craved now feel like an invitation to unknown terrors. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself listening for footsteps, for knocking, for that mocking laughter. And I wonder, with a shiver of fear, if whatever was in those woods has followed me home. The rock piles haunt my dreams, a simple arrangement of stones that has become a symbol of an encounter I can neither fully explain nor forget. They stand as silent sentinels in my nightmares, reminding me that sometimes the most terrifying things are those that leave no trace, save for the indelible mark they leave on our psyche. And the name Elias, I never found any record of an owner by that name. It remains, like the laughter, a chilling mystery. The roadside debris. The moment I stepped out of my car, I knew I'd made a mistake, potentially fatal one. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the soft ticking of my cooling engine and the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of wind through the tall pines lining the deserted highway. I should have kept driving. I should have trusted my gut. But I didn't, and that single, ill-fated decision nearly cost me everything. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive home, a 4-hour stretch of highway I'd traveled countless times before. But as night descended and the miles ticked by, exhaustion began to set in. The white lines on the road started to blur, and I caught myself nodding off more than once. I needed to stop, just for a moment, to shake off the fatigue and regain my focus. That's when I saw it. A haphazard pile of debris blocking the road ahead. Logs, branches, and what looked like chunks of broken concrete were strewn across both lanes, creating an impassable barrier. I slowed to a stop, my headlights illuminating the obstacle. It was strange. There hadn't been any construction signs, no warnings of road work, just this sudden, inexplicable blockage in the middle of nowhere. I shifted the car into park and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The night was eerily quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets chirping, no distant rumble of traffic, just the soft whisper of wind through the trees, a sound that now seemed more menacing than soothing. As I approached the debris, a prickling sensation crawled across my skin. Something felt off. The arrangement seemed too deliberate, too carefully placed to be the result of a random landslide or a fallen tree. The logs were stacked, almost neatly, the branches intertwined in a way that spoke of human intention, not natural chaos. I glanced back at my car, then down the road in both directions. No other vehicles in sight, just me, my car, and this inexplicable, unsettling roadblock. I pulled out my phone, hoping to call for assistance, but the screen mocked me with its stark, no service message. Of course, why would anything be easy? I sighed, realizing I'd have to move some of this debris myself if I wanted to get through. As I bent down to grab the end of a hefty log, a flicker of movement caught my eye, just at the periphery of my vision. There, at the edge of my headlight's reach, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, were footprints. Fresh footprints, the disturbed earth still settling. Someone had been here, and recently. I straightened up, suddenly acutely aware of how exposed, how vulnerable I was. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting the decision. My voice sounded small and weak in the vast darkness. No response, but I could have sworn I heard a twig snap, somewhere in the inky blackness beyond the road. I should have gotten back in my car right then. I should have reversed, turned around, and driven away as fast as my tires could carry me. But curiosity, that damnable human trait, the one that gets us into so much trouble, got the better of me. I took a few hesitant steps toward the tree line, squinting, trying to pierce the veil of darkness. That's when I heard it. The low, guttural rumble of an engine. Relief, immediate and intense, washed over me. Another car was approaching. I wasn't alone out here. I turned back toward the road, ready to flag down the approaching driver to ask for help. But my relief was short-lived, extinguished as quickly as it had flared. There, idling about 50 yards behind my car, was a dark-colored pickup truck. Its headlights were off, the engine purring almost silently. I hadn't heard it pull up, hadn't seen any approaching lights. It was as if it had materialized out of the darkness itself. "Hey!" I called out, waving my arms, trying to appear larger, more confident than I felt. "Can you help me? The road's blocked." The truck didn't move. I couldn't make out the driver through the tinted windshield, just a dark, indistinct silhouette. A chill, sharp and icy, snaked down my spine. Something wasn't right. This felt wrong. I started walking back toward my car, trying to maintain a steady pace, despite the rising tide of panic threatening to overwhelm me. The truck's driver's side door opened with a creak that seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his features obscured by the shadows. "Need some help." His voice was deep, casual, but there was an undercurrent to it, a subtle menace that set my teeth on edge. I stopped, my hand hovering over my car door handle. Yeah," I replied, my voice betraying a tremor I couldn't control. "There's a bunch of debris blocking the road. I was just about to try and clear it." He started walking toward me, his gait slow, deliberate, almost predatory. "Nasty business that," he said, his voice closer now, "happens sometimes out here. Folks aren't careful about what they're carrying." As he got closer, I could make out more details. He was wearing a thick, heavy jacket, despite the mild weather. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and a baseball cap, pulled low over his eyes, concealed most of his face. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, now just a few feet away. "Never know what kind of trouble you might run into." My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. Every instinct screamed at me to get in the car, to lock the doors, to drive. Debris be damned. But he was too close now. If I made a move, he'd be on me before I could even close the door. "I'm fine," I managed to say, striving to keep my voice steady. My husband is expecting me. He'll be worried if I'm late." The man chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Is that so? Funny. I didn't see a ring on your finger when you were waving your arms about earlier." Ice flooded my veins. He'd been watching me. For how long had he been there, lurking in the darkness, before I even noticed the truck? "Look," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "I don't want any trouble. Why don't you just go on ahead? I'll figure out how to get around this mess." He took another step closer, invading my personal space. I could smell him now, a pungent combination of cigarette smoke and something metallic, something vaguely unsettling. "Oh, I don't think you'll be going anywhere for a while," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his words laced with a chilling certainty. That's when I heard it, movement in the woods behind me. More than one person by the sound of it. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the full extent of the trap I'd unwittingly walked into. The man smiled, and in the dim light, I saw the glint of teeth, too sharp, too predatory. "Like I said," he murmured, his voice a silken threat, "folks aren't careful about what they're carrying out here. Sometimes, things fall off trucks. Sometimes those things are valuable. And sometimes, well, sometimes we need to make sure no one interrupts while we collect our lost property." I didn't think. I just reacted. In one fluid motion, I yanked open my car door and threw myself inside. The man lunged forward, his hand grasping for my arm, but I slammed the door shut just in time, his fist pounding against the window with frustrated rage. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a defiant growl in the face of imminent danger, just as more men emerged from the woods, 3 of them, running toward my car with purposeful strides. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing in protest as I backed up. The man who had spoken to me, now identified as the leader, dove out of the way, rolling across the asphalt with surprising agility. I spun the wheel, the car fishtailing wildly as I turned it around. In my rearview mirror, I saw the men running back to their truck, their shadowy figures illuminated by its suddenly blazing headlights. The truck's engine roared to life, a menacing growl that echoed my own car's desperate struggle. I didn't hesitate. I slammed on the gas, my car lurching forward, a wounded animal fleeing its predators. The debris loomed ahead, an unavoidable obstacle, but I didn't slow down. I didn't have time to think, to plan. I just aimed for the section that looked least dense, closed my eyes for a split second, and prayed. The impact was jarring, brutal. My teeth rattled in my skull, and I bit my tongue, tasting the metallic tang of blood. The car bounced and scraped over the logs and branches, the undercarriage protesting with a series of sickening crunches and groans. Something cracked underneath, probably my oil pan, a distant, detached part of my mind supplied. But the car kept moving. I was through. The road ahead was clear, a ribbon of black asphalt stretching into the unknown. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine screaming in protest, coaxing every ounce of power from the damaged vehicle. The truck was behind me now, its headlights growing larger in my rearview mirror, twin beacons of pursuit. They were gaining on me rapidly. My battered car, with its likely punctured oil pan and who knew what other damage, was no match for their powerful truck on this straight, open stretch of highway. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, to paralyze me with fear, but I forced it down, clamping down on the rising hysteria with a desperate, iron will. I needed to think. I needed to find a way out of this nightmare. Up ahead, I saw a turnoff, a narrow, unpaved road that disappeared into the dense woods. It was a risky move. I had no idea where it led, if it was even passable. But staying on the main road was a death sentence. They would catch me, and then, I didn't want to think about then. I waited until the last possible second, then wrenched the wheel to the right, my car skidding violently, tires screeching in protest as I made the turn. The truck, unable to react in time, blew past the turnoff, its brake lights flaring briefly in the darkness. I had bought myself a few precious seconds, a momentary reprieve. The road was rough, little more than a dirt track, riddled with potholes and overgrown with weeds. My car rattled and shook, threatening to fall apart with every jarring bump, but I didn't dare slow down. Trees whipped past on either side, their branches scraping against the windows, creating a cacophony of unsettling sounds. I drove blindly, taking turns at random, guided only by instinct and a desperate hope that I was putting distance between myself and my pursuers. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a handful of minutes, I saw lights ahead, a gas station, its fluorescent glow a beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. I screeched into the parking lot, horn blaring, and threw myself out of the car, stumbling and nearly falling in my haste. The attendant, a young man with tired eyes and a bored expression, looked startled as I burst through the door, wild-eyed, disheveled, and babbling incoherently about men chasing me. He called the police while I huddled behind the counter, jumping at every sound, my body trembling uncontrollably. When the officers arrived, they were polite but skeptical. They listened to my story, took my statement, but their eyes held a hint of disbelief. They drove me back to the scene of the blocked road, but the debris was gone. The road was clear, smooth, as if nothing had ever happened. There was no sign of the truck, no sign of the men, no evidence of my terrifying ordeal. They were sympathetic in a detached, professional way, but their words offered little comfort. No evidence, no crime, they said, the familiar refrain a hollow echo of my own despair. I sold my car soon after that night. Couldn't stand the sight of it. The dents and scrapes a constant, painful reminder of how close I'd come to. I didn't even want to think about it. I don't drive that road anymore. Don't drive much at all if I can help it. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that man's smile, still hear the sound of footsteps in the woods, still feel the phantom pressure of his hand on my arm. And I wonder, with a shudder, how many others have fallen for that trap, on that lonely stretch of road? How many weren't as lucky as I was? So, if you're ever driving late at night, and you come across an unexpected blockage on the road, in the middle of nowhere. Don't stop. Don't get out of your car. Just turn around and drive away, as fast as you can, because you never know who or what might be waiting in the darkness, ready to spring a trap you may not escape. The memory of that night, the chilling realization of how easily kindness can be a mask for cruelty, will forever be etched into my mind. And the name Jedediah, the name the driver gave me, will forever be associated with the darkest depths of human depravity. The eyes of the forest. The woods have eyes. I know that now, with a chilling certainty that settles deep in my bones and refuses to be dislodged. What I believed would be a peaceful, solitary camping trip, a chance to reconnect with nature and escape the suffocating pressures of my life, devolved into a nightmare that continues to haunt my waking hours and invade my dreams. The rustling leaves, the snapping twigs, the whispers in the darkness. They weren't just the ambient sounds of the wilderness. They were warnings, warnings I foolishly ignored. I'd always considered myself an outdoors person, finding solace in the quiet grandeur of nature. But life, as it often does, had a way of interfering with my passions. Work, relationships, the mundane but relentless demands of everyday existence had conspired to keep me tethered to the concrete jungle. Then, everything fell apart. I lost my job, position I'd poured my heart and soul into. My long-term relationship imploded, leaving me heartbroken and adrift. I felt lost, unmoored, like a ship without a rudder. That's when I decided it was time to reclaim myself, to reconnect with the wilderness, to find some semblance of peace and clarity amidst the chaos of my life. I chose a spot deep within the Whisperwind National Forest, miles from the nearest town. The kind of place where you can truly feel alone, immersed in the raw, untamed beauty of nature. I packed light, taking only the essentials. A small, one-person tent, a sleeping bag, some basic cooking supplies, and enough dehydrated food to last a few days. The plan was simple: hike in, set up camp, and spend a few days soaking in the solitude, allowing the wilderness to heal my wounded spirit. The hike in was breathtakingly beautiful. Late autumn had painted the forest in a rich tapestry of gold, crimson, and russet. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the invigorating scent of pine and damp earth. As I walked, the sounds of civilization, the incessant drone of traffic, the distant wail of sirens faded away, replaced by the gentle rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional, melodious call of a bird. I felt myself beginning to unwind, the knot of tension in my chest slowly loosening. I found the perfect spot just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the forest floor. It was a small clearing, nestled near a babbling stream, sheltered by towering pines that seemed to reach for the sky. I set up my tent with practiced ease, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the evening. That first night was everything I'd hoped for. I sat by the fire, mesmerized by the dancing flames, watching as the stars emerged, one by one, in the inky blackness above. The silence was profound, absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the gentle gurgle of the nearby stream. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of profound peace, a connection to something larger than myself. I must have dozed off by the fire, because the next thing I remember is jolting awake to complete darkness. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint, reddish glow over the clearing. I blinked, disoriented, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a rustling sound, just at the edge of the clearing. My initial thought was that it must be an animal, a deer, perhaps, or a raccoon foraging for food. But as I listened, I realized the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, to be that of a wild creature. It sounded like footsteps, slow, measured footsteps, circling the perimeter of my campsite. My heart began to race, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I sat perfectly still, straining my eyes, trying to pierce the impenetrable darkness beyond the dying firelight. The footsteps continued their unsettling circuit, never hurrying, never slowing, just a steady, relentless pace. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and wavering in the vast silence of the night. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more oppressive, more unnerving than the sound had been. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, listening, waiting. I waited, every muscle tense, every sense on high alert, for something, anything, to happen. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I began to convince myself that I had imagined it all. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest, the isolation, my own heightened state of anxiety. They had simply conspired to play tricks on my mind. I let out a shaky laugh, a nervous release of tension, and chided myself for my paranoia. I retreated to my tent, zipping it up tight, as if the thin fabric could offer any real protection from whatever might be lurking outside. Sleep, however, was long in coming, and when it finally did arrive, it was fitful and disturbed, filled with unsettling dreams of whispers and shadows. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sun streaming through the trees, chasing away the darkness and the lingering remnants of my nocturnal fears. I stepped out of my tent, stretching and yawning, ready to shake off the unsettling events of the night. That's when I saw it. There, just a few feet from where I had been sleeping, was a symbol scratched into the dirt. A crude circle with a straight line bisecting it. My blood ran cold. This hadn't been there yesterday. Someone or something had been in my camp while I slept. I approached the symbol cautiously, as if it might suddenly spring to life. The line was deep, clearly carved with purpose. This was no random scratch in the dirt. This was a message of some kind. My eyes darted around the clearing, suddenly acutely aware of how exposed I was, how vulnerable. The trees, which had seemed so welcoming, so protective the previous day, now loomed ominously, their shadows concealing who knew what horrors. That's when I saw him, or it. I'm still not entirely sure. Just beyond the tree line, partially hidden behind a massive, ancient pine, was a figure. It was tall, much taller than any human I'd ever seen, and unnaturally thin, its limbs seemingly elongated and distorted. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to shift and ripple, blending seamlessly with the dappled shadows of the forest. And where its face should have been, there was only a void, a darkness deeper than the shadows around it, a blank, featureless expanse that somehow, impossibly, seemed to stare at me. A primal fear, raw and visceral, gripped me, the kind of terror our ancient ancestors must have felt when confronted with the unknown, the untamed predators of a primordial world. I blinked, and it was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. But the image was burned into my mind, a nightmare made flesh, a haunting specter that would forever occupy the darkest corners of my memory. My hands shaking uncontrollably, I began to break camp, tearing down my tent, stuffing my belongings haphazardly into my backpack. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump, my nerves frayed and raw. I felt eyes on me, watching me from the depths of the forest, but every time I looked up, there was nothing there. Just trees, just shadows. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I heard a whisper, so faint I almost missed it, carried on the breeze, like a sigh, like a secret. "Stay!" I froze, the sleeping bag clutched to my chest like a shield. The words seemed to echo in my head, growing louder with each repetition. "Stay, stay, stay." "No!" I said aloud, my voice cracking, betraying the terror that consumed me. "No, I'm leaving, right now." I threw my belongings into my backpack, no longer caring about neatness or organization. I just needed to get out of there, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place, this presence. As I shouldered my pack and turned to leave, I saw them, dozens of those symbols, carved into the trunks of the trees surrounding the clearing, circles with lines through them, some fresh, the bark still oozing sap, others old and weathered, almost obscured by moss and lichen. How had I not noticed them before? I ran. I didn't care about following the trail, about finding my way back. My only thought was escape. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging welts. Roots, hidden beneath the thick carpet of leaves, snagged at my feet, threatening to send me sprawling. But I kept going, my lungs burning, my legs aching, the primal fear fueling my flight. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that terrifying, endless forest. The trees all looked the same, and more than once, I feared I was running in circles, lost in a labyrinth of my own making. But I didn't dare stop. Finally, mercifully, I broke through the tree line and onto a road. A paved road, a sign of civilization. I nearly cried with relief. I followed it, my pace never slowing, until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of a small town. The attendant looked at me like I was crazy when I burst in, wild-eyed, scratched up, and babbling incoherently. I probably was crazy at that point. I babbled about the symbols, the whispers, the figure in the woods. He listened patiently, then called the police. The officers who responded were kind, but skeptical. They took my statement, then drove me out to where I had camped. But when we arrived, the clearing was empty. No tent, no fire pit, no symbols carved into the dirt or the trees. It was as if I had never been there at all. They chalked it up to an overactive imagination, perhaps brought on by stress or dehydration. Suggested I see a doctor, get some rest. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. I've tried to put it behind me, to rationalize it as a panic attack, a hallucination, a figment of my stressed-out mind. But on quiet nights, when the wind whistles through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear that whisper again. Stay. Sometimes, I dream of that figure in the woods. In my nightmares, it follows me, always just out of sight, but never far behind. I wake up in a cold sweat, the image of the circle and line seared into my mind's eye. I don't go camping anymore. Don't even like to be in heavily wooded areas. The rustle of leaves sets my heart racing, and the snap of a twig can send me into a full-blown panic. People say the woods are peaceful, a place to connect with nature and find yourself. But I know better now. I know that sometimes the woods are watching, waiting, and if you're not careful, they might decide to keep you. That symbol, it haunts me still. I see it everywhere. In the grain of wood, in the cracks in the sidewalk, in the steam rising from my morning coffee. A circle with a line through it. So simple, yet so utterly terrifying in its implications. What did it mean? Why was it there? And why do I feel, deep in my bones, that it wasn't a warning, but an invitation? I don't have answers to these questions, and part of me hopes I never will. But I know one thing for certain. The next time I hear a whisper in the woods, I won't stick around to find out what it's saying. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some invitations are better left unanswered, especially when they come from the dark heart of the forest, where ancient things still lurk in the shadows, waiting for the unwary to wander too far from the path. And the name I called myself, Rowan, I haven't used it since, feels tainted, the uninvited guest. The old man's eyes didn't match his smile. That should have been my first and most glaring red flag. But when you're lost in the woods, cold, hungry, and utterly disoriented, even the strangest of shelters, the most unsettling of hosts, can seem like a beacon of hope, a sanctuary in a sea of despair. It wasn't until I was inside, the door bolted firmly shut behind me, that I realized, with a sickening lurch of my stomach, that sometimes being lost is infinitely safer than being found. I hadn't intended to stray from the marked trail. The day had begun perfectly. Crisp autumn air, the satisfying crunch of fallen leaves underfoot, and a well-maintained path winding through some of the most breathtakingly beautiful forests I'd ever encountered. I'm an experienced hiker, not prone to rookie mistakes, but somewhere between admiring a particularly stunning vista and attempting to capture the perfect photograph for my social media feed, I lost the trail. At first, I wasn't overly concerned. I had my phone's GPS, a compass, and enough provisions to last me for a day hike. But as the hours wore on, and the sun began its inexorable descent towards the horizon, a creeping sense of unease began to settle in. My phone's battery was dwindling rapidly, and the terrain, once familiar and welcoming, now seemed alien and hostile. Endless trees, rocky outcroppings that offered no clue as to direction, and a deepening silence that was both unsettling and disorienting. Just as panic was starting to set in, threatening to overwhelm my reason, I saw it. A thin, almost ethereal trail of smoke rising above the trees in the distance. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And where there's fire, there are people. Hope surged through me, a warm, welcome wave washing away the cold dread. I quickened my pace, pushing through the thick underbrush, my eyes fixed on that tantalizing wisp of smoke, my only guide in the encroaching darkness. The cabin appeared suddenly, almost unexpectedly, as if it had grown organically out of the forest itself. It was small and weathered, its wooden walls aged to a silvery gray, smoke curling lazily from a crooked stone chimney, and a warm, inviting glow spilling from its windows. Relief, pure and undiluted, washed over me. I hurried to the door, knocking perhaps a bit too eagerly, my knuckles rapping against the aged wood. The door creaked open and he stood there, an old man, probably in his 70s, with a scraggly white beard that reached halfway down his chest, and deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. He smiled, but the smile, it felt wrong, somehow, like he was practicing an expression he'd seen, but didn't quite understand, didn't quite feel. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind, a hint of something unplaceable lurking beneath the surface. "You look a mite lost." I explained my predicament, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice, trying to sound calm and collected, despite the frantic pounding of my heart. The old man, Silas, he called himself, listened patiently, nodding along, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he stepped back from the door, a gesture of invitation. "Can't leave you out here in the cold, now can I?" he said. "Come on in and warm yourself by the fire." I hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Something in the back of my mind whispered a warning, a subtle but insistent note of caution. But the promise of warmth, of shelter, of human contact, overrode any lingering misgivings. I stepped inside. The cabin's interior was cozy, if somewhat cluttered. Every surface seemed to be covered with an odd assortment of objects. Old, leather-bound books, strange-looking tools with purposes I couldn't fathom, jars filled with unidentifiable, vaguely unsettling contents. A fire crackled merrily in a large, stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that was both welcoming and slightly eerie. Silas busied himself in the small, rudimentary kitchen area, putting a kettle on a wood-burning stove. "Nothing like a hot cup of tea to chase away the chill," he said, his back to me, his voice muffled by the clatter of crockery. "Make yourself comfortable." I sank into an old, worn armchair, feeling the day's exertions catching up with me. The warmth of the fire, the sense of being out of the cold, out of the darkness, began to lull me into a state of false security. Silas returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to me before settling into a chair opposite. "So," he said, fixing me with those unsettling, piercing eyes, "what brings you to these parts? Not many folks come up this way anymore." I explained about my hike, about how I'd gotten turned around, lost my way. As I talked, I noticed Silas nodding along, but his eyes kept darting to the windows, as if he were expecting someone or something to appear. "Yep," he said when I finished, his voice taking on a strange, faraway quality. "These woods, they can be tricky. Been up here for, must be 40 years now. Seen all sorts come and go." Something about the way he said "go" made me pause, a flicker of unease rekindling in my gut. "Go?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "You mean other hikers?" Silas's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. It remained a superficial, unsettling grimace. "Oh, all sorts. he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Hikers, campers, folks just passing through. This forest, it has a way of calling to people, you might say. I sipped my tea, trying to ignore the growing knot of apprehension in my stomach. You must get lonely up here all by yourself, I said, attempting to steer the conversation back to safer ground. His laugh was sudden and sharp, like the crack of a whip, startling me. Lonely? He said, his voice rising in pitch. No. I'm never alone up here. The forest, she keeps me company. And then, there's the visitors, of course. Like me, I said, attempting a smile, but my lips felt stiff and uncooperative. Silas's eyes locked onto mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something there, something dark and ancient and utterly terrifying, that made my blood run cold. Oh no, he said, so softly I almost didn't hear him. You're special. I've been waiting a long time for someone like you. I set my mug down, my hand trembling so violently I nearly spilled the hot tea. I should probably get going, I said, standing up abruptly, my legs feeling shaky and unreliable. If you could just point me in the direction of the main trail. Oh, but you can't leave now, Silas said, rising from his chair with a swiftness that belied his age. Night's falling, and the forest. She gets hungry after dark. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I'll take my chances, I said, my voice betraying my growing fear. Thank you for the tea, but I really need to go. I turned toward the door, my hand reaching for the knob, but Silas was there before me, moving with an unnatural speed that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. He stood between me and the exit, that unsettling, fixed smile still plastered on his face. I'm afraid I can't let you do that, he said, his voice low and dangerous, the earlier pretense of hospitality completely gone. You see, I made a deal, a long time ago. The forest, she provides for me, keeps me safe, but in return, she needs to be fed. And you, my dear, you're the finest meal she's had in years. I looked around frantically, searching for another way out. The windows were small, too small to climb through. There was a back door, but Silas stood directly between me and it. My eyes fell on a heavy iron poker, leaning against the fireplace. What are you talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, to buy myself time as I inched toward the fireplace. What deal? Who are you, really? Silas's smile faded, replaced by a look of almost childlike confusion, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Who am I? He said, his voice faltering. I'm Silas. I've always been Silas, haven't I? For a moment, he looked lost, adrift, as if questioning his own identity. But then, his eyes cleared, and that terrible, predatory smile returned, wider and more unsettling than before. It doesn't matter who I am, he said, his voice regaining its chilling certainty. What matters is that you're here, and the forest is waiting. I lunged for the poker, grabbing it with both hands and swinging it in front of me like a makeshift weapon. Stay back, I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. Silas didn't seem fazed by the threat. He took another step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. You don't understand, he said, his voice taking on a strange, echoing quality, as if it were coming from multiple sources at once. You can't leave. No one ever leaves. I swung the poker again, this time connecting with his shoulder. He stumbled back, but there was no cry of pain, no visible reaction, just that unwavering, terrifying smile. He kept coming. I ran for the back door, fumbling with the lock, my hands slick with sweat. I could hear Silas behind me, his breathing ragged and uneven, the sound of his footsteps growing closer. The door finally gave way, and I burst out into the gathering darkness. The forest seemed different now, transformed. The trees loomed larger, their branches reaching out like grasping, skeletal hands. The wind whispered through the leaves, and I could have sworn I heard my name, called out in a voice that was both familiar and utterly alien. I ran blindly, heedlessly, no longer caring about direction, about finding the trail. My only thought was to escape, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cabin, between myself and Silas. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging welts. Roots, hidden beneath the thick carpet of leaves, seemed to reach up, deliberately, to trip me. But I kept running, fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been minutes, it could have been hours. The forest blurred around me, a swirling vortex of shadows and indistinct shapes. More than once, I thought I saw figures moving in the darkness, always just at the edge of my vision, watching me, following me. Finally, my legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. As I lay there, trying to regain my composure, trying to gather my scattered wits, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the leaves, drawing closer. I looked up, and there was Silas, standing just a few feet away. He looked different now. His skin seemed to ripple and shift, blending with the shadows around him. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, twin points of malevolent light. "You can't run from the forest," he said, his voice no longer his own. It was deeper, older, filled with the rustle of leaves, the creak of ancient trees, the whisper of the wind. "She's in your blood now. She's tasted you, and she won't let you go." I scrambled to my feet, ready to run again, to fight, to do whatever it took to survive. But I found I couldn't move. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, to soften. Roots, thick and sinuous, curled around my ankles, holding me fast. Silas, or whatever he had become, reached out a hand, his fingers elongated and distorted, like the branches of a gnarled tree. "Don't fight it," he said, his voice a chorus of whispers. "Become part of the forest, like I did, all those years ago. It's not so bad, once you get used to it." As his hand touched my shoulder, I felt a strange sensation, a tingling warmth that spread through my veins, like sap flowing through the branches of a tree. The forest around me seemed to come alive, pulsing with an ancient, hungry energy. I wanted to scream, to fight, to resist. But as the forests seeped into me, I found I didn't want to anymore. Why had I been so afraid? This was where I belonged. This was home. The last thing I remember is Silas's smile. No longer unnatural, no longer unsettling, but welcoming. A smile I now understood. And as the forest embraced me, I smiled back. And the name Elara, the name I thought was mine, it faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the leaves. Serpentine shadows, encounters with the venomous unknown. My childhood was, in many ways, idyllic. I grew up on a sprawling farm in the heartland of America, a landscape of rolling hills, verdant pastures, and the endless expanse of the open sky. It was a life immersed in nature, a world of rustling cornfields, lowing cattle, and the constant, comforting presence of animals. Yet, beneath this veneer of rustic tranquility lurked a danger, a silent, slithering threat that would shape my life in ways I could never have imagined. Venomous snakes. It was as if I possessed some unseen, magnetic quality that drew these deadly creatures to me, resulting in a series of encounters that would leave me forever scarred, both physically and emotionally. My first encounter, a brutal introduction to the perils of the natural world, occurred when I was a mere slip of a girl, barely old enough to comprehend the concept of mortality. The task was a simple one, a chore I had performed countless times before, collecting fresh eggs for our family's breakfast. I remember skipping out to the chicken coop, a weathered wooden structure that housed our flock of clucking hens, my small, woven basket swinging rhythmically at my side. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of dew-kissed grass and the earthy aroma of the farm. The coop itself was a haven of organized chaos. Hens strutted and pecked, their feathers ruffled, their clucking a constant, low-level hum. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls. I approached the first nesting box, a cozy nook lined with straw, and gently lifted the hen, revealing a clutch of warm, speckled eggs. I carefully placed them in my basket, offering the hen a gentle pat on her head, a gesture of gratitude for her contribution to our morning meal. Then I moved to the next box. It was a seemingly innocuous act, this simple movement, but it would forever alter the course of my life. As I stepped forward, a searing pain exploded in the back of my leg. It felt as if I had been struck by a baseball bat, wielded with brutal force. A scream, raw and primal, tore from my throat, echoing through the confines of the coop. I instinctively turned, my eyes desperately searching for the source of the agonizing pain. And that's when I saw it. A snake, thick and muscular, its scales a mosaic of earthy browns and yellows, slithered away from me, its body undulating with sinuous grace. It was a western diamondback rattlesnake, a creature of immense power and deadly venom, and it had just sunk its fangs into my flesh. My grandfather, a weathered, stoic man who had spent his entire life working the land, came running, drawn by my terrified screams. His face, normally etched with lines of quiet strength, was contorted with alarm. Pointed, my voice trembling, towards the retreating serpent, managing to gasp out the words, "Snake bit me." Without hesitation, he grabbed a nearby shovel, his movements swift and decisive. He dispatched the snake with a brutal efficiency born of years of experience dealing with the dangers of the farm. But the damage was done. The venom was already coursing through my veins, a silent, invisible poison threatening to extinguish my young life. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital corridors, sterile rooms, and the constant, agonizing pain of the antivenom treatment. I remember the fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of being trapped in a body that was no longer my own. I hovered on the brink of death, my small frame struggling to fight off the insidious effects of the venom. There were moments, shrouded in darkness, when I felt myself slipping away, drawn towards an unknown abyss. But I survived. Against all odds, I pulled through, emerging from the ordeal with a newfound respect for the power of nature and a deep-seated fear of snakes. The physical scars would fade, but the emotional ones would remain, a constant reminder of my brush with death. The memory of that searing pain, the sight of the snake slithering away, the weeks of agonizing treatment, it was all etched into my psyche, a trauma that would shape my future interactions with the natural world. Years passed. I grew older, stronger, but the fear remained, a silent companion that lurked in the shadows of my mind. I tried to avoid situations that might bring me into contact with snakes, but it was a futile effort. It seemed as if they were drawn to me, as if some unseen force was conspiring to bring us together. My second encounter occurred when I was around 9 or 10 years old. It was a lazy summer afternoon, and I was fishing with my uncle and my brother on a friend's sprawling property. The pond, a shimmering expanse of water reflecting the azure sky, was teeming with fish, a promise of a bountiful catch for our planned fish fry. I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about sharing a small boat with my brother, a boisterous, energetic boy who seemed to possess an endless supply of annoying antics. Seeking refuge from his relentless teasing, I retreated to the bottom of the boat, my Walkman, a relic of a bygone era, clamped firmly over my ears. I sought solace in the music, trying to drown out the sounds of my brother's incessant chatter and the gentle lapping of the water against the hull. The sun beat down, warm and comforting, and I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the rhythmic sway of the boat and the monotonous hum of the outboard motor. I awoke to a cacophony of sound. Over the music blaring in my ears, I could hear my uncle screaming my name, his voice laced with a terror I had never heard before. I fumbled with the Walkman, pulling it off my head, my heart already pounding with a premonition of something awful. I looked up at my uncle, and his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. His eyes were wide, his skin pale, and he was pointing, with a trembling hand, towards something just over my left shoulder. I was too terrified to move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear that was both instinctive and overwhelming. I had no idea what my uncle was seeing, what had caused this sudden, dramatic shift in his demeanor. But I knew with a chilling certainty that it was something bad, something dangerous. And then I felt it, a light, fleeting touch, a subtle flicker against my hair. It was a sensation so faint, so seemingly innocuous, that I almost dismissed it as a figment of my imagination. But my uncle's continued terror, his unwavering gaze fixed on something just behind me, confirmed that this was no illusion. My uncle, seemingly galvanized by a surge of adrenaline, grabbed his weapon, a hunting rifle he always kept close at hand, and a boat oar. He aimed the rifle, the barrel pointing directly over my left shoulder, his finger hovering over the trigger. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, a moment of suspended reality where the world seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head, my eyes following the trajectory of my uncle's gaze. And there it was, a snake, its head black and sleek, was crawling up the side of the boat, its body slithering along the wooden planks with a disturbing grace. It was a water moccasin, also known as a cottonmouth, a venomous serpent known for its aggressive nature and potent venom, and it was heading straight for me. This time, the scream that tore from my throat was involuntary, a primal expression of pure, unadulterated terror. I jumped, a desperate, instinctive attempt to escape the snake's path. Simultaneously, my uncle fired his rifle, the deafening blast echoing across the still waters of the pond. The boat rocked violently, and I lost my balance, tumbling to the floor, my ears ringing from the gunshot. The snake was gone. Whether it had been struck by the bullet or simply startled by the noise, I didn't know. All I knew was that I was alive, that I had, once again, narrowly escaped a potentially fatal encounter with a venomous serpent. The experience left me shaken, trembling, my fear of snakes reinforced, my sense of vulnerability heightened. It seemed as if I was destined to be forever haunted by these slithering creatures, that they would forever be a source of terror in my life. I was starting to feel like I was in a real-life horror movie, that these instances would continue to happen to me. The subsequent encounters, though equally terrifying, followed a similar pattern. There was the teenage summer job, laying carpet in dilapidated trailers, where I unearthed a rattlesnake in a dark, dusty closet. The sound of its rattle, a chilling, unmistakable warning, sent shivers down my spine, triggering a wave of primal fear that left me paralyzed, unable to move until my father's friend, bless his heart, bravely removed the creature. He came across as an angel in that moment. And then there was the romantic outing, a seemingly idyllic day spent cutting firewood with a boyfriend, where I unwittingly chose a resting spot directly beside a massive copperhead, its scales blending seamlessly with the rocky terrain. The snake, content to bask in the sun, remained blissfully unaware of my presence until my boyfriend, with a horrified gasp, alerted me to the danger. The ensuing scramble to escape, the frantic attempts to distract the snake, the sheer, unadulterated terror of knowing that a single misplaced step could result in a deadly bite. It was all a blur of adrenaline and fear. I never went back for my jacket. These encounters, each one a chilling reminder of my vulnerability, have left an indelible mark on my psyche. I have become hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly scanning for any sign of snakes, any hint of danger. The fear, once a manageable anxiety, has grown into a full-blown phobia, a constant companion that lurks in the shadows of my mind. I know rationally that the chances of encountering a venomous snake are relatively slim, especially in my current urban environment. But the fear remains a primal, instinctive response to a threat that has, on multiple occasions, come perilously close to ending my life. And so, I live with this fear, this constant awareness of the serpentine shadows that lurk in the hidden corners of the world, waiting to strike, the whispers of Willow Creek, a small-town enigma. I want to preface this narrative by emphasizing the setting. The vast, sparsely populated expanse of northern Ontario, Canada. The specific locale is a village, so diminutive in size and so intentionally shielded from prying eyes that I shall refrain from divulging its name, prioritizing the privacy of its inhabitants. This isn't one of those quaint, picturesque hamlets often romanticized in travel brochures. It's a place where secrets simmer beneath the surface, a community grappling with the harsh realities of a world that often feels forgotten. This is the backdrop against which a seemingly innocuous summer afternoon took a decidedly sinister turn. My companion on this fateful day was Stephanie, a friend since childhood. We were both 14 at the time, navigating the awkward, exhilarating, and often perilous waters of adolescence. Like many teenagers, we sought connection, entertainment, and a temporary escape from the mundane routines of our lives. The long, languid days of summer break stretched before us, promising freedom and adventure, or at least the illusion thereof. Stephanie, in her characteristic impulsiveness, had messaged my mother via her mother's cellular phone, as neither of us possessed such sophisticated technology at that age, to propose a rendezvous. The idea of a hangout, as we so eloquently phrased it, was instantly appealing. The plan was simple, almost painfully so. A 20-minute walk into town, the acquisition of sugary confections at a local convenience store, and a subsequent period of aimless loitering. It was the epitome of teenage boredom, yet it held a certain allure, a promise of freedom and spontaneity. We set off around 2 in the afternoon, the summer sun beating down upon us with relentless intensity. The walk itself was uneventful, the landscape a monotonous blur of rural scenery. We passed fields of swaying crops, weathered farmhouses, and the occasional rusting vehicle abandoned at the side of the road. The air was thick with the scent of dust and the distant hum of insects. It's a common trope in these sorts of stories to paint the setting as idyllic, a place of untroubled innocence where nothing ever happens. But this town, our town, was the antithesis of that cliché. It was, to put it bluntly, a hotbed of illicit activity. Drug trafficking, violent assaults, and a general sense of lawlessness were not uncommon occurrences. The local newspaper, when it wasn't reporting on bake sales and high school sports, was filled with stories of drug busts, arrests, and the ongoing struggle to maintain some semblance of order. Yet, despite this grim reality, we, in our youthful naivete, believed ourselves to be immune. We had never personally witnessed any of these unsettling events, and therefore, in our limited worldview, they did not truly exist. We were invincible, untouchable, shielded by the blissful ignorance of adolescence. This, of course, was a tragically flawed assumption, a dangerous misconception that would soon be shattered by the events that were about to unfold. We finally reached our destination, the aforementioned convenience store, a beacon of sugary delights in the otherwise desolate landscape. We purchased our treats, the usual assortment of candy and sugary drinks, and settled down on the curb outside, basking in the glow of our youthful rebellion. It was the epitome of teenage ennui, a scene repeated countless times in countless small towns across the continent. Another friend of mine, Mark, happened to reside in town. Stephanie, ever the social butterfly, suggested we pay him a visit, using the opportunity to show me his place of residence. Eager for any distraction from the monotony of our afternoon, readily agreed. We set off once more, navigating the labyrinthine back roads of the town, our steps light and carefree. We soon found ourselves on a street that could only be described as sketchy. The houses were dilapidated, their paint peeling, their yards overgrown with weeds. There was an air of neglect, of abandonment that permeated the atmosphere. It was the kind of street that made you instinctively quicken your pace, your senses heightened, your awareness sharpened. We passed an auto repair shop, its garage door wide open, revealing a man engrossed in his work, tinkering with the innards of a vehicle. I offered a polite nod, a gesture of acknowledgement in this otherwise desolate environment. We continued our trek, passing by a series of houses that appeared to be unoccupied. It was a stark contrast to the bustling activity of the convenience store, a reminder of the isolation and emptiness that characterized much of small-town life. In the 21st century, people, especially teenagers, seemed to be always inside. Then we saw him. He was sitting in a lawn chair in the front yard of one of the houses, a figure that seemed utterly out of place in this already unsettling landscape. He was an older man, perhaps in his 50s or 60s, with a shock of white hair and a long, unkempt beard that reached his chest. His attire was unremarkable, but his posture was peculiar. He was sitting in the chair, but the back of the chair was resting on the ground, his legs extended straight up into the air. It was a bizarre, almost comical sight, yet it filled me with a sense of unease. It was this oddity, this deviation from the norm that caught our attention. And then he saw us. "Can you come help me?" he called out, his voice loud, demanding, devoid of any hint of politeness. We stopped, exchanging a look of confusion. I, ever the eager helper, started to move towards him, my initial instinct being to offer assistance. "I think he fell over," I said to Stephanie, my voice barely above a whisper. We should help him, but Stephanie, ever the pragmatist, held me back. She placed a restraining arm in front of me, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "There's no way we could lift him up," she reasoned, her voice tinged with doubt. "We're too small." The man's demeanor had shifted. His initial request for help had transformed into a series of increasingly agitated screams. "Get over here," he yelled, his voice laced with a menacing undertone. "Get over here now." My heart began to race. The situation had taken a decidedly unsettling turn. My gut instinct, that primal, intuitive sense of danger, was screaming at me to flee. Why couldn't he simply roll over onto the grass and get up himself? There was no sign of a wheelchair, a walking stick, or any other assistive device that might explain his predicament. His continued screaming, his increasingly aggressive tone, fueled my growing sense of alarm. Suddenly, I remembered the man in the auto repair shop, just a short distance down the street. He was our only hope, our only potential source of assistance. "If he really needs help," I said to Stephanie, my voice trembling slightly, "we should go get that man." Stephanie, her initial skepticism seemingly overridden by the urgency of the situation, nodded in agreement. We turned to the old man, our voices raised in a desperate attempt to communicate our intentions. "We're getting help," we shouted. "We'll be back in a minute." And then we ran. We raced down the street, our lungs burning, our hearts pounding in our chests. We stumbled into the auto repair shop, gasping for air, our words tumbling over each other in a frantic attempt to explain the situation. "There's a man down the street. He might be hurt. He looks like he fell." Without hesitation, without questioning our panicked pleas, the mechanic followed us back to the property. We halted in front of the house, our bodies still trembling from the exertion, our minds reeling from the sudden shift in events. But the yard was empty. The lawn chair was gone. The old man was nowhere to be seen. We stood there, dumbfounded, our eyes scanning the empty space, our minds struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. We had been gone for less than a minute, a mere handful of seconds. Even if he had managed to get up on his own, even if someone had come to his aid, there was simply not enough time for them to disappear so completely, so utterly. We stammered out an explanation to the mechanic, our voices laced with confusion and disbelief. He was just here, screaming at us, to help him, the mechanic. His face, etched with a mixture of concern and bewilderment, offered a tentative explanation. Maybe he got up himself and just walked inside. I doubted that theory profoundly. The tone of the man's voice, the unsettling way he had been sitting, the suddenness of his disappearance. It all pointed to something far more sinister, far more inexplicable. But I nodded my head in agreement, grasping at any semblance of rationality in this increasingly bizarre situation. The mechanic, in a gesture of kindness, offered us some water bottles. We thanked him, our voices still shaky, and went on our way, our initial plan of visiting our friend completely forgotten. The encounter had shaken us to our core, leaving us with a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that something was profoundly wrong. To this day, the incident remains etched in my memory, a perplexing enigma that defies logical explanation. Where did the old man go? Why was he sitting in such a bizarre position? What were his intentions? These questions continue to haunt me, fueling a sense of unease that I cannot fully shake. I still live near that town. Years later, I visit frequently, yet I have never once encountered the old man again. It's as if he vanished into thin air, a ghost in the machine of our small-town reality. Perhaps, as the mechanic suggested, he simply got up and walked inside. But the memory of his voice, the chilling tone of his demands, the unsettling way he had been sitting, and the sheer impossibility of his disappearance, it all points to something far more sinister, far more inexplicable. And so, I am left with this lingering question, this unresolved mystery, a constant reminder of that strange, unsettling summer afternoon when the whispers of Willow Creek revealed a darkness that I can never fully comprehend. And truthfully, I hope I never see him, or anyone like him, ever again. The uninvited guest, footsteps in the silence. Despite my occasional struggles with insomnia, a persistent battle against the nocturnal quiet, I have always considered myself a deep sleeper. Once slumber finally claims me, I descend into a realm of profound unconsciousness, a state from which it is notoriously difficult to rouse me. This heavy sleep is often accompanied by a vivid, almost cinematic dream life. My nights are filled with elaborate narratives, surreal landscapes, and a cast of characters both familiar and fantastical. I've never, however, managed to achieve the elusive state of lucid dreaming. The moment I become aware that I am within a dream, the excitement, the sheer novelty of the realization, invariably jolts me awake, either completely or partially, transforming the dream from an immersive experience into a detached observation, like watching a film projected onto the back of my eyelids. I've never actively pursued lucid dreaming techniques. The potential benefits, the ability to control the narrative of my dreams, to explore the boundless landscapes of my subconscious, are alluring, certainly. But the risk, the possibility of encountering the chilling phenomenon of sleep paralysis, is simply too great. I already grapple with occasional night terrors, those terrifying episodes of intense fear and disorientation that erupt from the depths of sleep and anxiety dreams, those relentless replays of my deepest insecurities and fears. The thought of experiencing one of those episodes while partially awake, aware of my surroundings yet trapped within the paralysis, is, to put it mildly, a nightmare in itself. There are moments, however, fleeting and unpredictable, when I hover on the threshold between sleep and wakefulness, particularly during daytime naps. My body, exhausted and depleted, succumbs to slumber, but my mind retains a fragile thread of awareness. In this liminal state, I can perceive the sounds of the world around me, the rustling of leaves outside my window, the distant hum of traffic, even the muffled conversations of people nearby. Ironically, it is during these periods of semi-consciousness that I am most prone to sleep talking. If someone engages me directly, asks me a question, I might respond, my answers often nonsensical, fragments of dreams bleeding into the waking world. On even rarer occasions, I can be in the midst of a dream and simultaneously narrate its events to those present. A bizarre, real-time commentary on the unfolding drama of my subconscious. My life, at the time of this particular incident, was characterized by a certain degree of stability, yet tinged with an underlying current of anxiety. I lived with my husband, Ethan, a man of sturdy build and unwavering loyalty. My work schedule, however, had recently undergone a significant shift, disrupting my carefully cultivated sleep patterns. I struggled to adjust to the new rhythm, finding it increasingly difficult to wake up before 9 or 10 in the morning. This seemingly minor inconvenience would, as it turned out, play a crucial role in the unsettling events that were about to unfold. On occasion, when Ethan left for his night shift, I would rise from bed, bleary-eyed and disoriented, to let our two dogs, a pair of loyal, if somewhat overprotective companions, out for their morning ritual. After their brief excursion, I would invariably return to the warm embrace of our bed, seeking to recapture the elusive remnants of sleep. In my sleepy haze, I would sometimes forget to lock the front door, a lapse in security that, while seemingly minor, would later fill me with a profound sense of dread. If uncertainty arose, if the nagging doubt about the locked door crept into my consciousness, I would usually force myself out of bed, shuffling through the quiet house to double-check. But there were times, moments of utter exhaustion, when I simply couldn't muster the energy, when I succumbed to the overwhelming desire to drift back to sleep, leaving the door and our safety to chance. Ethan, being a man of routine and predictability, often found himself sent home early from his shift. The nature of his work, which I won't detail here for the sake of privacy, occasionally required him to return during the night to assist with unforeseen tasks. These unexpected returns were usually uneventful. I had become so accustomed to the sound of his heavy work boots thudding against the wooden floors of our house that it rarely disturbed my sleep. At most, his arrival might pull me into that semi-aware state, where I would register his presence, feel the familiar dip of the mattress as he climbed into bed beside me, and then drift back into the depths of slumber, comforted by his proximity. We lived in a secluded area, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. Visitors were a rarity, a phenomenon so infrequent that it bordered on the extraordinary. Yet, despite this isolation, despite the unlikelihood of any unwanted intrusion, I harbored a persistent, irrational fear, the fear that someone would attempt to break into our house during the day, while Ethan was at work and I was alone, vulnerable, and potentially asleep. I had two guard dogs, theoretically capable of deterring any would-be intruder. But one of them, a beloved old companion, was now deaf, his ability to detect approaching danger severely compromised. The other, a young, enthusiastic puppy, was more likely to cower in silence than to bark at any perceived threat. He had that kind of scared nature. My defenses, I realized with a growing sense of unease, were woefully inadequate. Now, onto the chilling events of that particular morning. It began like any other. Ethan, following his usual routine, rose from bed, showered, dressed, and, after planting a gentle kiss on my forehead, departed for his night shift. The house settled into silence. The only sounds the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional sigh of the wind rustling through the trees outside. Hours passed. I drifted in and out of sleep, my mind hovering on the border between wakefulness and the dream world. I was vaguely aware of the sunlight gradually illuminating the room, the shadows shifting and stretching as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Not long after, I slipped back into a state of deeper sleep, a realm devoid of dreams, a silent, empty void. Then, a sound pierced the stillness, pulling me back towards consciousness. It was the familiar sound of Ethan's heavy boots, their rhythmic thud echoing through the front of the house. Neither of our dogs stirred, their silence suggesting that they recognized the sound, that they were not alarmed by the presence of this intruder. The noise level was low, subdued, not enough to jolt me fully awake, but enough to register in my semi-conscious state. I lay there, patiently waiting for Ethan to make his way to our bedroom, anticipating the familiar comfort of his presence, the warmth of his body next to mine. We would cuddle up, drift back to sleep, and the morning would continue its uneventful course. But then, a horrifying thought, a cold wave of dread, washed over me. What if it wasn't Ethan? Had he forgotten to lock the door when he left? Was this the intruder I had so long feared, the silent, unseen threat that had haunted my waking thoughts? Was I about to become a victim, trapped in my own home, unable to defend myself? The footsteps, those heavy, deliberate steps, were now making their way down the hallway, approaching our bedroom. My eyes, I believe, were open at this point. I could see the familiar outlines of our room, the furniture, the curtains, the door leading to the hallway. I was watching that door, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath caught in my throat, anxiously awaiting the appearance of something. And then, the realization struck me, a chilling certainty that sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. These boots, they didn't sound like Ethan's. The rhythm was different, the weight, the cadence. It was a subtle difference, perhaps imperceptible to anyone else. But to me, in that moment of heightened awareness, it was as clear as a bell. This was not my husband. This was someone else. A sense of impending doom, heavy and suffocating, filled the room. I felt utterly helpless, trapped, exposed. My dogs, my supposed protectors, were either unaware of the danger or utterly incapable of defending me. And I, still trapped in that liminal state between sleep and wakefulness, was too disoriented, too sluggish to react, to defend myself. As the footsteps reached the doorway, I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate, futile attempt to deny the reality of the situation. I prayed, silently, fervently, that the intruder would mistake me for being asleep, that he would attempt to sneak out of the house without being detected. I heard the footsteps pause in the doorway, a moment of agonizing suspense. The silence was broken only by the frantic pounding of my heart, a drumbeat of terror that echoed in my ears. I could feel, with a chilling certainty, the presence of this unknown entity, this malevolent force that had invaded my sanctuary. Then, I felt the weight shift on my side of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly as he leaned over me, as if to whisper in my ear. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated horror. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that I did not want to hear what he was about to say. I had to do everything in my power to block out his words, to prevent them from penetrating my consciousness. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I strained my ears, focusing all my energy on the tiny muscles within, causing my eardrums to tremble, to vibrate, creating a deep, rumbling sound that filled my head, drowning out all other external noises. It was a desperate, instinctive act of self-preservation, a shield against the unknown horrors that were about to be unleashed. I felt the lightest sensation of his breath on my ear, on my jawbone, a fleeting, chilling touch that sent shivers down my spine. But I continued to strain, to maintain the rumbling sound, to block out his words. Then he stood back up. The weight on the bed lifted, and I heard the heavy footsteps retreat, exiting the room, leaving me alone, once again, in the silence of my home. The paralysis broke. I was free. I jumped out of bed, my body trembling, my heart still racing. I grabbed the nearest weapon we had, a heavy, cast-iron skillet, and with a surge of adrenaline-fueled courage, I combed through the house, searching every room, every closet, every corner, for any sign of the intruder. But there was nobody there. The front door was locked, undisturbed. Our dogs were calm, seemingly oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded. The house was silent, empty, yet the fear, the visceral, palpable fear, lingered, a cold weight in the pit of my stomach. I placed the skillet back on the stove, my hands still shaking. I messaged Ethan, recounting the events of the morning, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Later, I shared the experience with my sister-in-law, Sarah, a woman who, unlike me, had a deep and abiding belief in the paranormal, in the existence of unseen forces that could interact with our world. Sarah had, over the years, experienced her own share of unsettling encounters, events that defied logical explanation. She had delved into the world of the supernatural, researching, exploring, seeking answers to questions that most people preferred to ignore. She listened to my story with a quiet intensity, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. She didn't dismiss my experience as a mere dream, a product of my overactive imagination. She didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, she said something that chilled me to the bone. "It's a really good thing," she said, her voice low and serious, "that you didn't let it put things in your head." Her words, cryptic and unsettling, amplified the terror I had already felt. What did she mean? What things could the intruder have put in my head? What would have happened if I had listened to his whispered words? Was he going to tell me something, some terrible secret, some devastating truth that would forever alter my perception of reality? Or was he going to command me to do something, something unspeakable, something that I would be unable to resist? A part of me, a morbidly curious part, wished I knew. But the larger, more rational part of me was grateful, profoundly grateful, that I had blocked out his words, that I had resisted the urge to listen. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, a fear of the unknown, a fear of the darkness that lurked just beyond the periphery of my awareness. It was a fear that would stay with me, a constant reminder of the day I encountered the uninvited guest, the silent intruder who walked with footsteps that were not my husband's. And it made me question, for the first time in my life, whether the world was truly as rational, as predictable as I had always believed. The unseen, the unknown, had brushed up against my reality, leaving a trail of terror and uncertainty in its wake. The Journal of Disquiet. Ethan was a creature of meticulous habit. His life was an orchestra of precisely timed events, each day unfolding with the predictability of a well-oiled machine. He tracked everything: the calories in his meals, the minutes he spent meditating, the precise routes of his errands. It wasn't an obsession, he insisted, merely a preference for order. His leather-bound journal was the cornerstone of this structured reality, a tangible record of his existence. So, when words he hadn't written appeared within its pages 3 evenings prior, a cold dread gripped him, chilling him to the marrow. He'd arrived home at his usual 10:58 p.m., after a day of mind-numbing spreadsheet analysis and a client meeting that had gone on longer than predicted. After the ritual of brushing his teeth and changing into his comfortable, worn pajamas, he'd settled at his mahogany desk, ready to transcribe the day's events into the journal. The journal sat innocuously on the top of everything in the drawer. He slipped the tiny, silver key, always nestled deep in his right-hand pocket, into the lock, the familiar click a small comfort in the growing unease. But the book was already open, not to the last page he'd filled with his neat, looping script, but to a page somewhere in the middle, a jarring intrusion of unfamiliar handwriting. It was a stark contrast to his own, angular, precise, with no flowing curves, like the precise incisions of a scalpel. The ink was a deep, almost unnaturally vibrant blue. It wasn't a prank. The drawer had been locked, the key secure. Nothing else in his meticulously arranged apartment seemed disturbed. The words themselves were a chilling enigma. I encountered him again, this time at the Shadowed Lantern, the bar near the abandoned transit depot. He persists in this delusion that we are one and the same. It's unsettling. He mirrors my appearance, my speech, but the essence is distorted. I fear for my sanity. The date at the top matched the current day, but the time was an impossibility. 4:17 p.m. At precisely 4:17 p.m., Ethan had been in a tedious budget review meeting with his supervisor, Mrs. Albright, a woman with a voice like sandpaper and a permanent frown. He hadn't been anywhere near a bar, let alone a dilapidated one by an abandoned bus station. A frantic pulse hammered at his temples. He ran a trembling finger across the ink. Dry. Definitely dry. There wasn't even the faintest residual scent of a freshly used pen. He flipped back through the preceding pages, his anxiety escalating with each turn. Nothing. His own meticulous records stared back at him, an island of order in a sudden sea of chaos. He checked page after page. Nothing. The edges of the notebook were smooth, pristine. No evidence of tampering, no ripped pages clumsily reinserted. He closed the journal, the leather cool against his sweating palm, and locked it away. Sleep was a distant, unattainable shore that night. His mind was a whirlpool of impossible scenarios. A break-in? But who and why? A bizarre lapse in his memory? But he'd never experienced anything like that before. And the handwriting, it was utterly foreign. The next morning, the harsh light of day offered no solace. He'd hoped that the pre-dawn hours had somehow distorted his perception, that the entry would have vanished, a figment of a restless mind. But when he opened the drawer with the tiny key, it was, and opened the journal. The words remained, stubbornly etched onto the page. And beneath them, a new edition, a fresh wave of ice-cold dread. He asserts we share a parallel existence. He even produced keys, an identical set to my own. He recited my address, described the peculiar creak in the third floorboard outside my door. I feel physically ill. The world tilted. He hadn't written those words. He hadn't even thought them. A cold, clammy hand seemed to grip the back of his neck. His phone buzzed, a jarring reminder of the looming workday. He had to leave to force himself back into the routine, but the journal, the impossible words, had burrowed deep under his skin. He locked the journal away, a physical manifestation of the growing chaos within him, a silent scream trapped in a leather-bound cage. The feeling of dread lingered. I will stop here and await your instructions to continue with the next story. The Whispers of Witherwind Well. Arthur Blackwood, a freelance photographer with a penchant for the desolate and forgotten corners of the world, had always prided himself on his unflappable nature. He'd photographed abandoned asylums, crumbling factories, and landscapes scarred by time and neglect, all without a flicker of fear. But the events at Witherwind Well, that seemingly innocuous, moss-draped relic, had shaken him to his core. He'd been on a solitary expedition, seeking out landscapes that whispered stories of the past. He was driving along a narrow, unpaved road, the kind that doesn't appear on most maps, when he spotted a weathered, hand-painted sign, Witherwind Farm Lodgings. The letters were faded, cracked, the wood itself warped by years of sun and rain. Intrigued by the prospect of capturing the late afternoon light on a potentially forgotten homestead, he pulled over. The path leading to the farm was overgrown, a tunnel of gnarled branches and tangled weeds. He parked his battered Jeep near a dilapidated fence, the wooden posts leaning at precarious angles, and grabbed his camera, a trusty Nikon that had seen better days. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. The only sound was the incessant drone of unseen insects. He climbed over the fence, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. The field stretched out before him, a panorama of neglect. A small, dilapidated farmhouse stood in the distance, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching wilderness. Beside it, a crumbling stable leaned precariously, its roof sagging under the weight of years. A large, gnarled oak tree, its branches twisted like arthritic fingers, dominated the scene. It was the well, however, that drew Arthur's attention. Situated near the stable, it was a circle of rough-hewn stones, covered in a thick carpet of emerald moss. A broken, rusted pulley system hung over it, the rope frayed and dangling uselessly. The well exuded an aura of ancient stillness, a silent sentinel in a landscape of decay. It was, he thought, the perfect subject. He approached the well cautiously, the light catching the glistening moss and casting long shadows. He raised his camera, adjusted the focus, and snapped several shots from various angles, capturing the texture of the stone, the play of light and shadow. He leaned closer, wanting a detailed shot of the moss. The stones were slick with moisture, the moss surprisingly cold beneath his fingertips. He peered into the well's depths. It was a black abyss, seemingly bottomless. A faint, cold draft rose from its depths, carrying the scent of stagnant water and something else, something indefinably ancient and unsettling. He held his breath, listening, and then he heard it, a whisper, a faint, sibilant sound, like air escaping through clenched teeth. And within that whisper, he thought, just for a fleeting moment, he heard his own name. His stomach lurched. He recoiled, nearly dropping his camera. He scanned the area, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing. No one. Only the silence, broken only by the drone of insects. He checked his phone, no signal, of course. He told himself it was the wind, a trick of acoustics, the echo of his own imagination. But doubt, cold and insidious, had taken root. He decided to record the sound, to prove to himself that it was nothing more than a natural phenomenon. He switched his camera to video mode, leaned over the well, and pressed record. He held the camera at arm's length, pointing it down into the darkness, his arm trembling slightly with a mixture of anticipation and unease. He let it record for a full minute, trying to keep his breathing quiet, his body still. The silence stretched, taut and expectant. He was about to retrieve the camera, convinced he'd captured nothing but the ambient sounds of the desolate landscape, when he saw it. A flicker, a flash of something in the darkness below, a reflection, but not his own. It was a face, or the suggestion of a face. Eyes that were too wide, too hollow. A mouth stretched open in a silent scream, or perhaps a gasp. It was distorted, inhuman, yet undeniably present. He yanked the camera back, his hands shaking so violently he almost fumbled it. He switched off the recording, his breath catching in his throat. He glanced at the screen, expecting, hoping to see a glitch, a lens flare, anything that could explain the impossible image. The screen flickered and went black. He turned the camera over, his heart sinking. The lens, it was covered in scratches, but not on the outside. The scratches were internal, deep gouges that marred the delicate glass elements. It was as if something had reached inside the camera and clawed at its very core. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his composure. He inspected the lens closely. The exterior glass was smooth, pristine. The damage was entirely internal, impossible, defying all logic and reason. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He turned, scanning the deserted farmyard. Nothing, no one, only the silent well, the crumbling buildings, and the encroaching darkness. He heard a wet, slithering sound from the well, like something shifting in the water below. He didn't wait. He turned and fled, back towards his jeep, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the muddy ground. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see something pursuing him, some monstrous shape emerging from the well's depths. The farmhouse, with its offer of lodgings, seemed like a distant, impossible haven. He reached his car at last, and with trembling fingers, found the correct key. Arthur fumbled with the car keys, his hands slick with a cold sweat. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and deep purple. He glanced back at the farm, the well a dark, ominous circle in the growing gloom. He had no desire to spend the night there, but the thought of navigating the treacherous, unpaved road in the darkness was equally unappealing. He remembered the hand-painted sign he'd seen earlier, Witherwind Farm Lodgings. It was a gamble, but it was better than the alternative. He started the jeep, the engine sputtering to life, and drove slowly back towards the farmhouse, his headlights cutting a swathe through the gathering darkness. The farmhouse was even more dilapidated up close. The paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, and the porch sagged precariously. A single, flickering light bulb illuminated the front door. He parked the jeep, grabbed his camera bag, and approached cautiously. A tall, gaunt man with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the surrounding landscape answered his knock. He introduced himself as Silas, the owner of the farm. Silas had a slow, deliberate way of speaking, his voice a low rumble that seemed to echo the silence of the countryside. He offered Arthur a room for the night, the price surprisingly low. Arthur paid in cash, not mentioning the well, the face, or the ruined camera. He felt a deep-seated reluctance to share his experience, a fear of being dismissed as delusional. The room Silas showed him was small and sparsely furnished, with a narrow bed, a rickety chair, and a dusty wooden desk. The air smelled of mildew and old wood, but it was shelter and it was away from the well. He locked the door, a flimsy lock that offered little real security, and sat on the bed, his body aching with exhaustion and a lingering unease. He tried to examine the camera again. It was completely dead. The battery was still showing a partial charge, but the device wouldn't power on. Not even the charging light would illuminate. He unscrewed the lens, his fingers fumbling with the delicate mechanism. The rear element was just as badly scratched as the front. The marks were intricate, almost deliberate, forming a chaotic spiral pattern that seemed to draw his eye inward. He touched them with a microfiber cloth, but they were, of course, on the inside, unreachable. He set the camera aside, defeated. He needed to clear his head. He opened the window, hoping for some fresh air. The night was dark, moonless. The only light came from the single bulb near the farmhouse door and a faint, distant glow that might have been another farm or a passing car. The air was cold, carrying the scent of rain. He showered in the small ensuite bathroom. The water pressure was weak, the temperature fluctuating erratically between scalding and freezing. He tried to wash away the grime and the lingering fear, but the image of the distorted face in the well, the impossible scratches on the lens, remained seared into his mind. After his shower, wrapped in a thin, threadbare towel provided by Silas, he sat at the desk, trying to organize his thoughts. He heard a faint sound outside, a soft, rhythmic dripping. He paused, listening. It wasn't rain. It was heavier, more viscous. And then he heard another sound, a slithering, scraping noise, like something wet and heavy being dragged across a rough surface. His blood ran cold. He crept to the window, his heart pounding. He kept the room lights off, hoping to see better in the darkness. He peered out, his eyes straining. First, he saw nothing. Then, he heard the sound again, closer this time, coming from the side of the farmhouse. It was a slimy, dragging sound, accompanied by the persistent dripping. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging the pain. And then he saw it, a shape, a dark, amorphous mass clinging to the wall of the farmhouse, just below the roofline. It was large, several feet across, and it seemed to be moving, slowly, inexorably, upward. Its edges rippled and undulated, and he could see a glistening trail behind it, reflecting the faint moonlight. It looked like a giant slug, a grotesque, formless thing that defied all natural laws. He recoiled from the window, his stomach churning. He grabbed his phone, still no signal. He considered screaming for Silas, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if Silas would believe him, and he wasn't sure he wanted to draw the attention of whatever that thing was. He locked the door again, knowing it was a futile gesture. He grabbed his flashlight, its beam cutting a swathe through the darkness. He pointed it at the window, but the glare reflected back, obscuring his view. He stood there, frozen, listening to the scraping sound, now coming from the roof above. He heard a soft thud, as if something heavy had landed on the shingles. He had to get out. He had to get away from that farmhouse, from that thing. He grabbed his clothes, dressing quickly, his hands still trembling. He decided to check the hallway to see if there was another way out. He opened the door a crack, peering out. The hallway was dimly lit by a single, bare bulb at the far end. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he stepped out, his flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of him. He reached the main living area of the farmhouse. The front door was locked, bolted. The windows were shut, but he could see the outline of the truck parked outside, and the dark, silent trees beyond. He was about to try the front door when he heard Silas's voice, coming from another room, perhaps the kitchen. He was humming, a low, tuneless melody. Arthur hesitated. He didn't want to confront Silas, not with that thing crawling around outside, but he needed to get out. He walked towards the sound of Silas's humming, his flashlight beam illuminating the way. He found Silas in the kitchen, standing at the sink washing dishes. He turned when he saw Arthur, his eyes, in the dim light, seeming to reflect the same unsettling emptiness Arthur had seen in the well. "Everything all right?" Silas asked, his voice a low drawl. Arthur struggled to find his words. I heard something." He stammered. "Outside, on the roof." Silas gave him a long, slow look. "Probably just a possum," he said, his voice flat, unconcerned. "Or a stray cat. We get them around here." It sounded bigger," Arthur insisted, his voice trembling. Silas shrugged. "Could be a raccoon. They can get pretty big." He turned back to the sink, resuming his dishwashing. Arthur didn't believe him, He knew what he'd seen, what he'd heard. He thanked Silas, his voice barely a whisper, and retreated back to his room. He locked the door, shoved the rickety chair against it, and sat on the bed, his camera bag clutched in his lap. He didn't sleep. He sat there, listening to the scraping sounds, the dripping, the occasional thud from the roof. He waited for dawn, for escape. As the first hint of gray lightened the sky, Arthur was already packed and ready to leave. He hadn't slept a wink, his senses on high alert, listening to the unsettling sounds outside. He peered through the curtains, and his stomach clenched. On the side of the farmhouse, clearly visible in the pre-dawn light, were dark, glistening streaks. They trailed up the wall towards the roof, like the tracks of some enormous slug. They were fresh, still wet, and they glistened ominously in the faint light. He grabbed his bag, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to get out now. He paid Silas for the night, avoiding eye contact, not mentioning the streaks, the ruined camera, or the terror that had gripped him throughout the night. Silas merely nodded, his expression unreadable. Arthur practically ran to his jeep, fumbling with the keys. He started the engine, the roar a welcome sound in the oppressive silence. He glanced back at the farmhouse one last time. The streaks were still there, a stark reminder of the night's horrors. He put the jeep in gear and sped away, leaving Witherwind Farm and its unsettling secrets behind. He drove for hours, not stopping until he reached a bustling town, a place filled with noise and light and people. He tried to power on his camera again at a rest stop, hoping against hope that it was just a temporary malfunction. It remained dead. The scratches on the lens, those impossible internal scratches, were still there, a permanent reminder of the encounter at the well. He knew he couldn't go back to his normal life, not yet. He had to understand what had happened. He drove to a camera repair shop, a small, independent place in a quiet part of the city. He showed the camera to the technician, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She examined the lens carefully, turning it over in her hands, frowning. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, her voice laced with a mixture of puzzlement and concern. "The scratches are inside. It's like something got in there and clawed at it." Arthur's heart sank. Her words echoed his own fears. "Can it be fixed?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She shook her head. "I doubt it. The damage is too extensive. It's beyond repair." He thanked her, took the camera back, and left the shop, feeling a profound sense of loss. It wasn't just the monetary value of the camera. It was the loss of a trusted tool, a companion on his solitary journeys. And it was a tangible piece of evidence, a physical manifestation of the impossible events at Witherwind Well. He spent the next few days in a daze, going through the motions of his life, but his mind was constantly replaying the events at the well, the farmhouse, the creature on the wall. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of being watched, of being followed. He started researching local folklore, searching for any mention of Witherwind Farm, of strange occurrences in the area. He found nothing concrete, only vague rumors, whispered stories of a cursed well, of unexplained disappearances, of a presence that lurked in the shadows. He considered going back, confronting Silas, demanding answers. But the memory of those empty eyes, the chilling indifference in his voice, held him back. He knew, deep down, that Silas wouldn't tell him anything, and that returning to Witherwind Farm would be a mistake. He's still haunted by the image of the distorted face in the well, the slimy trail on the farmhouse wall, the feeling of something cold and wet clinging to his ankle. He still jumps at sudden noises, still scans the shadows, half expecting to see that amorphous shape, that grotesque, crawling thing. He knows he can't prove what he saw, what he experienced. He has only his ruined camera, his fractured memories, and a deep-seated fear that will likely never leave him. He's learned a harsh lesson. Some places are best left unexplored. Some secrets are best left undisturbed. And the whispers of Witherwind Well will forever echo in his mind, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of our perception. He is forever changed. The portrait of Dorian Blackwood. Eleanor Vance had always been drawn to the melancholic beauty of forgotten things. As an art restorer, she spent her days breathing new life into faded canvases, mending chipped frames, and coaxing stories from the silent figures captured in portraits. So, when she received a call about a collection of paintings inherited by a distant relative, she was intrigued, though slightly wary. The relative, a Mr. Alistair Finch, had no interest in art and simply wanted the paintings assessed and, if possible, sold. The paintings arrived in a large, wooden crate, smelling faintly of sawdust and old varnish. Most were unremarkable landscapes, scenes of rolling hills and cloudy skies, rendered in the muted palettes of a bygone era. But one portrait stood out. It depicted a man in formal attire, the style suggesting the late 18th or early 19th century. He was posed against a dark, indeterminate background, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. But his face was a blur. It wasn't simply faded or damaged. It was as if the paint had been deliberately smudged, wiped away, leaving only a vague impression of features. The eyes were empty sockets, the nose a formless bump, the mouth a pale, indistinct smear. The rest of the painting, however, was remarkably detailed. The intricate buttons on his coat, the delicate lace at his cuffs, the faint suggestion of a brocade pattern on the wall behind him. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. There was something unsettling about the deliberate obliteration of the face, a deliberate act of silencing. She set the other paintings aside and focused on the portrait. She placed it on an easel in her studio, under the bright, even light of her work lamps. She examined the canvas closely. The paint was old, cracked in places, but the blurring of the face seemed intentional. There were no signs of accidental damage, no water stains, no evidence of clumsy restoration attempts. It was as if someone had meticulously erased the identity of the sitter, leaving only a haunting, anonymous shell. She decided to start with a basic cleaning. She gently wiped the surface of the painting with a soft cloth, removing years of accumulated dust and grime. As she worked, she noticed a slight irregularity in the texture of the paint around the blurred face. It felt raised, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. She continued cleaning, her curiosity growing. As the grime lifted, she began to see faint lines, whispers of features, emerging from the blurred area. It was subtle, almost invisible, but there was the suggestion of a brow ridge, the curve of a cheekbone, the hint of a jawline. She stepped back, her heart beating a little faster. It was as if the face was slowly, painstakingly, revealing itself. She knew it was impossible, that paint couldn't spontaneously regenerate, but the evidence was right there in front of her. She spent the rest of the day working on the painting, meticulously cleaning and documenting every detail. As the evening light faded, she noticed another change. The area around the mouth, previously just a pale smear, seemed to be darkening, taking on a more defined shape. It was still blurred, still indistinct, but there was the undeniable suggestion of lips, forming a faint, enigmatic curve. Eleanor felt a growing sense of unease, a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She knew she should stop, that she should leave the painting alone until she could consult with other experts, but she couldn't resist. She felt drawn to it, compelled to uncover the secrets hidden beneath the blurred surface. She decided to leave the painting in the studio overnight, under the bright work lamps. She locked the door, a strange sense of anticipation building within her. She told herself it was just professional curiosity, the thrill of uncovering a hidden masterpiece. But deep down, she knew it was something more. It was as if the painting was calling to her, beckoning her to unravel its mysteries. As she fell to sleep, she began to hear a scratching at her door. Eleanor woke with a start. The scratching sound persisted, rhythmic and insistent. It wasn't coming from her studio door, but from her bedroom window. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and peered into the darkness. The window was closed, the curtains drawn. She got out of bed, her legs feeling shaky, and approached the window cautiously. She pulled back the curtains and saw nothing, just the empty street outside, bathed in the pale glow of a street lamp. The scratching had stopped. She stood there for a moment, listening, but the silence was unbroken. She told herself it was probably a branch or an animal, anything but the unsettling thought that had taken root in her mind. She couldn't go back to sleep. She made a cup of strong coffee and went into her studio, drawn by an irresistible force. The painting stood on the easel, bathed in the harsh glare of the work lamps. She approached it slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The face, it was no longer blurred. It was incomplete, still lacking in detail, but the basic features were undeniably there. Eyes, nose, mouth. They were faded, almost ghostly, but they were no longer a formless smear. It was as if the painting had somehow regenerated itself overnight. But it wasn't a normal face. There was something off about it. The eyes were narrow, almost slits, and they seemed to lack pupils, giving them a vacant, unsettling stare. The nose was sharp and aquiline, and the mouth was curved in a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. But it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was a sneer, a smirk, a look of cold amusement. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The face was beginning to resemble someone she knew. It was a faint resemblance, still lacking in detail, but it was undeniably there. It was starting to look like her. Panic clawed at her throat. She stumbled back, knocking against a small table, sending a jar of brushes clattering to the floor. She didn't bother to pick them up. She stared at the painting, her mind reeling. She tried to rationalize it. It was a trick of the light, a product of her overactive imagination, the result of staring at the painting for too long. But deep down, she knew it was something more. The painting was changing, and it was changing in a way that defied all logic and reason. She decided to cover it. She grabbed a large, heavy cloth from a shelf and draped it over the painting, completely obscuring the unsettling image. She felt a momentary sense of relief, as if she had somehow contained the disturbing presence. She spent the rest of the day trying to distract herself, working on other projects, answering emails, anything to keep her mind off the portrait. But it was no use. The image of the emerging face, the unsettling smile, was burned into her memory. That evening, she found herself drawn back to the studio. She stood outside the door, listening. Silence. She took a deep breath and opened the door. The cloth was on the floor. The painting stood on the easel, uncovered, the face staring out at her with its unervingly incomplete features. The eyes were more defined now, the pupils taking shape, dark and piercing. The mouth was more pronounced, the sneer more evident, and the resemblance to her own face was undeniable. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She wanted to run, to get away from the painting, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. She stared at the portrait, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. She noticed something else. The paint around the face, the area that had been blurred, seemed to be thicker, more textured. It was as if new layers of paint had been applied, building up the features, adding detail and depth. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the surface of the canvas. The paint was dry, but it felt different. It felt warmer than the surrounding areas, almost as if it were radiating a faint heat. She quickly withdrew her hand, her heart pounding. She knew she had to get rid of the painting. She couldn't keep it in her studio, in her home. It was too unsettling, too disturbing. She decided to take it to a colleague, a fellow art restorer who specialized in older paintings. Maybe he could offer a rational explanation, or at least help her dispose of it safely. She carefully wrapped the painting in bubble wrap and packing paper, obscuring the disturbing image. She carried it out to her car, her arms aching from the weight. She placed it in the back seat, securing it with a seatbelt. As she drove, she kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the painting move, to see the face shift and change. But it remained still, wrapped in its protective layers. She arrived at her colleague's studio, a cluttered space filled with the tools and materials of the trade. He greeted her warmly, his eyes widening slightly when he saw the size of the package she was carrying. "What have you got there, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice curious. "Something unusual," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I need your opinion on it." She carefully unwrapped the painting, revealing the portrait. Her colleague, a man named Mark, leaned in, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor explained the situation, the inheritance, the blurred face, the gradual emergence of the features, the unsettling resemblance to herself. Mark listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. When she finished, he remained silent for a moment, studying the painting. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "I've never seen anything quite like it." He examined the canvas, the paint, the brushstrokes. He used a magnifying glass to inspect the details. He ran his fingers along the frame. "The paint is old," he said, "definitely 19th century, but there's something strange about it. It's almost as if it's still wet." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "Wet?" she repeated. "But it's dry to the touch." Mark nodded. "I know. That's what's so puzzling. It's like the paint is active somehow, like it's still changing." He looked at Eleanor, his expression grave. "I don't know what to tell you, Eleanor," he said. "This is beyond my expertise. I've never encountered anything like this before." Eleanor felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had hoped for a rational explanation, a solution, but Mark's words only confirmed her worst fears. The painting was not just old. It was something else, something unnatural, something dangerous. Mark suggested they consult with a specialist in pigment analysis, someone who might be able to shed light on the unusual properties of the paint. He made a few calls, but the specialist wouldn't be available for several days. Eleanor felt a growing sense of urgency. She didn't want to take the painting back to her apartment, but she didn't want to leave it with Mark either. The idea of the portrait, with its ever-changing, increasingly familiar face, sitting in his studio, unnerved her. Could I leave it here for the night?" Eleanor asked, her voice hesitant. I don't feel comfortable taking it back home." Mark hesitated. He glanced at the painting, his expression troubled. "I don't know, Eleanor," he said. "There's something unsettling about this thing. I don't like the idea of it being here, unsupervised." "Please, Mark," Eleanor pleaded. "I'll feel much better knowing it's here with you. You have a security system, right?" Mark sighed. "Yes, I have a security system, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "All right," he said finally. "You can leave it here, but I'm putting it in the storage room under lock and key, and I'm covering it with a sheet." Eleanor agreed, relieved. They carefully carried the painting to a small, windowless storage room at the back of the studio. Mark locked the door, and Eleanor felt a small measure of the tension ease from her shoulders. She drove home, the city lights blurring through her tired eyes. She tried to focus on the road, on the mundane details of everyday life, but the image of the painting, the evolving face, the unsettling smile, kept intruding. She spent a restless night, tossing and turning, haunted by fragmented dreams of blurred faces and cold, empty eyes. She woke up feeling exhausted, her body aching with tension. The next morning, she received a frantic call from Mark. "Eleanor," he said, his voice strained, "you need to come back to the studio now." Her heart leaped into her throat. "What is it? What's happened?" "It's the painting," he said. It's gone." Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. "Gone?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "But the storage room was locked." "I know," Mark said. "The door was still locked. There's no sign of forced entry. It's just gone." Eleanor raced back to the studio, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Mark met her at the door, his face pale and drawn. "I don't understand it," he said, shaking his head. I checked the security footage. Nothing. No one entered or left the storage room. The painting just vanished. They searched the studio, every nook and cranny, but there was no sign of the portrait. It was as if it had simply evaporated into thin air. Eleanor felt a chilling sense of dread. The painting wasn't just gone. It was free. It was out there somewhere, and she had no idea what it was capable of. She went back to her apartment, her steps heavy and reluctant. She unlocked the door, her hand trembling. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the living room, the hallway, the kitchen. Everything seemed normal. The furniture was in place, the curtains were drawn, the air was still. But she felt a presence, a cold, unsettling feeling that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She walked slowly down the hallway towards her bedroom. She paused outside the door, listening. Silence. She took a deep breath and opened the door. And there it was, the painting, standing on the floor, leaning against her bedroom wall, facing the bed. The face was complete now. It was her face. Her eyes, her nose, her mouth. But the expression was not her own. It was a look of cold triumph, of malicious glee. The eyes were dark and piercing, the mouth curved in a cruel, mocking smile. It was her face, but twisted, distorted, into something monstrous. Eleanor screamed, a short, sharp, strangled sound that died in her throat. She stumbled back, her legs giving way beneath her. She fell to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. The painting seemed to shimmer slightly. The eyes in the portrait seemed to focus on her, to follow her movements. The smile seemed to widen just a fraction. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to get out. She had to escape. She turned and fled, running blindly out of the apartment, out of the building, into the street. She didn't stop running until she reached a busy intersection, a place filled with people and noise and light. She stood there, gasping for breath, her body shaking, her mind reeling. She didn't know where to go, what to do. The painting was out there, and it was wearing her face. Eleanor spent the next few days in a state of near-constant panic. She couldn't go back to her apartment, couldn't face the painting, the monstrous reflection of herself. She stayed in cheap motels, moving from one to another, always looking over her shoulder, expecting to see that familiar, yet terrifying face. She tried to contact Mark again, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She left several frantic messages, but he never called back. She started to wonder if something had happened to him, if the painting had done something. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Her mind was consumed by the image of the portrait, the cruel smile, the piercing eyes. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality, like she was slipping into a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. She started seeing the face everywhere, in reflections in shop windows, in the faces of strangers on the street, in the patterns of shadows on the walls. It was always fleeting, just a glimpse, but it was enough to send her heart racing, her breath catching in her throat. She knew she couldn't keep running. She had to do something, had to find a way to stop the painting, to destroy it. But she didn't know how. She started researching old folklore, legends, anything that might offer a clue. She spent hours in libraries, poring over dusty books, searching for any mention of paintings that came to life, of portraits that stole the souls of their sitters. She found fragments of stories, whispers of ancient curses, of artists who had dabbled in forbidden arts, of paintings that had been imbued with a malevolent power. But nothing concrete, nothing that offered a solution. One evening, exhausted and desperate, she found herself back near her apartment building. She didn't intend to go inside. She just needed to be close, to see if anything had changed. She stood across the street, hidden in the shadows, staring up at her window. The lights were off. The curtains were drawn. The apartment looked empty, abandoned. She saw a movement in the window, a flicker of something. She squinted, her heart pounding. It was the painting. She could see the outline of the frame, the faint glimmer of the canvas. It was watching her. She felt a surge of anger, a desperate, reckless courage. She couldn't keep running. She had to confront it. She crossed the street, her legs feeling heavy, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She reached the building entrance, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. She hesitated. A wave of fear washed over her, cold and paralyzing. She almost turned away, almost ran, but she couldn't. She had to face it. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hallway was dimly lit, the air thick with the familiar smell of old building and dust. She walked slowly towards her apartment, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She reached her door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. The key turned, the lock clicked. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The painting was there, in the living room, standing on an easel she didn't own. It was facing the doorway, as if it had been waiting for her. The face in the portrait was even more vivid now, more detailed. It was her face, perfectly rendered, but with that same cruel, mocking expression. The eyes seemed to bore into her, to strip away her defenses, to expose her deepest fears. Eleanor stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. She felt a cold, suffocating presence in the room, a sense of overwhelming dread. The painting seemed to pulse slightly. The colors seemed to deepen, to become more vibrant. The smile on the face seemed to widen, revealing a hint of sharp, pointed teeth. Eleanor finally found her voice. What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The painting didn't answer, of course, but the eyes seemed to flicker to acknowledge her question. "I want everything," the voice whispered. "I want your life. I want your soul. I want you." Eleanor felt a surge of terror, unlike anything she had ever experienced. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. She was trapped, paralyzed by fear. The painting began to shimmer, to vibrate. The colors swirled, the lines blurred. The face in the portrait seemed to melt, to flow, to transform. And then it stepped out of the frame. It was Eleanor, but not Eleanor. It was a perfect replica, a living, breathing copy, but with those same cruel eyes, that same mocking smile. The real Eleanor stared at her doppelganger, her mind unable to comprehend what was happening. She felt a cold hand grip her arm, a hand that was identical to her own, but impossibly strong. "It's time," the doppelganger whispered, its voice a chilling echo of Eleanor's own. "It's time to become one." Eleanor struggled, but the grip was too tight. She felt a cold, sharp pain in her chest, as if something was being ripped from her. She gasped, her vision blurring. The last thing she saw was her own face, smiling down at her, triumphant and terrifying. And then, everything went black. The doppelganger stood over the unmoving body and smoothed out her clothes. Taking a steadying breath, she went to make herself a cup of tea. The glitch in time, premonition or a second chance. This story, this anomaly, is one I've wrestled with for years. It's the kind of event that defies logic, that challenges the very foundations of our understanding of reality. I've never shared it publicly, fearing ridicule, dismissal, the inevitable accusations of fabrication or delusion. But the weight of it, the sheer, unexplainable strangeness of it, has become too heavy to bear in silence. So here it is, presented with as much honesty and accuracy as my memory, flawed as it may be, allows. The year was 2016. I was 26 years old, navigating the turbulent waters of early adulthood, grappling with the anxieties and uncertainties that come with forging one's path in the world. My life at that point felt ordinary, routine, predictable. I worked a mundane job, had a small circle of friends, and spent my evenings much like any other young adult, scrolling through social media, watching television, and occasionally venturing out for a night of socializing. One particular evening, I found myself at a local Irish pub, a dimly lit establishment known for its lively atmosphere, its extensive selection of beers, and its occasional live music performances. I was there with my best friend, Thomas, a man whose loyalty and humor had been a constant source of support throughout my life. Thomas was accompanied by his girlfriend, Sarah, a woman I had also befriended over the years, a vibrant, energetic presence who often found herself at odds with Thomas's more laid-back personality. We had initially planned to see a live band, a group we had enjoyed on previous occasions. But as fate would have it, the band never materialized. Their absence, however, did little to dampen our spirits. We settled into our usual routine: beer, conversation, and the occasional shared laughter that comes from years of accumulated inside jokes and shared experiences. Thomas and I, having arrived earlier, had already consumed a considerable amount of alcohol by the time Sarah joined us. I remember, with a twinge of guilt, Sarah's initial annoyance at Thomas's visibly inebriated state. She chided me, half-jokingly, for enabling his excessive consumption. But her irritation was short-lived. I ordered a round of tequila shots, a peace offering of sorts, and the tension dissipated, replaced by the familiar camaraderie that defined our trio. We talked, we laughed, we reminisced. We spoke of past adventures, of future plans, of the mundane details of our daily lives. It was the kind of comfortable, effortless conversation that flows easily between close friends, a balm for the anxieties and uncertainties that often plagued my thoughts. I remember feeling a sense of contentment, a fleeting moment of escape from the pressures and responsibilities of adulthood. But the evening, as evenings often do, took an unexpected turn. Thomas and Sarah, their relationship characterized by a volatile mix of passion and conflict, began to argue. The specifics of their disagreement are lost to the fog of memory, likely some trivial matter amplified by alcohol and the underlying tensions that simmered beneath the surface of their relationship. These arguments were a common occurrence, a recurring theme in their dynamic, and I usually tried to stay out of them, offering a neutral presence, a silent observer to their emotional roller coaster. This time, however, the argument escalated. Thomas, his voice raised in frustration, declared, "Fine, we'll just go home right now then." The words struck me like a physical blow. I felt a sudden pang of disappointment, a selfish desire to prolong the evening, to cling to this fleeting moment of connection and camaraderie. I didn't want the night to end, not yet. "Come on," I pleaded, my voice tinged with a desperate urgency. "Just stay for one more shot. On me." I signaled to the bartender, a weary-looking woman who had undoubtedly witnessed countless similar scenes unfold in this very establishment. She nodded, her expression unreadable, and began preparing the drinks. Thomas and Sarah, their argument seemingly forgotten, asked for their bills. I got up to use the restroom, my bladder protesting the copious amounts of beer I had consumed. As I stood at the urinal, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The alcohol, I realized, was starting to take its toll. I felt a knot of nausea tighten in my stomach, a premonition of the unpleasantness that was likely to follow. Maybe it was a mistake ordering another shot, I thought to myself, the words echoing in the silence of the restroom. As I exited the bathroom, I saw Thomas and Sarah standing by our table, their shot glasses already in hand, their faces illuminated by the dim, flickering lights of the pub. They were looking at me, their expressions a mixture of impatience and amusement. Come on," Thomas urged, his voice slurring slightly. He handed me my shot glass, the cold, smooth surface a stark contrast to the warmth of my hand. We clinked glasses, a ritualistic gesture of camaraderie, and uttered the customary cheers. Then we downed the shots, the fiery liquid burning a path down my throat. Thomas and Sarah rose from their seats, preparing to depart. I gave them both a hug, a gesture of affection and farewell. "How are you guys getting home?" I asked, the question tinged with a concern I couldn't quite suppress. "I'm just gonna drive," Thomas replied, his voice nonchalant, as if the question was utterly inconsequential. A wave of alarm washed over me. "Just get a cab," I insisted, my voice sharper than I intended. "You don't want to get pulled over or crash your new car," he argued, dismissing my concerns with a wave of his hand. "It's only a 5-minute drive," he said. It's not worth leaving my car here to take a cab. I persisted, my anxiety growing with each passing moment. I knew he was drunk, that he was in no condition to drive, but he was stubborn, resistant to my pleas. "It'll be fine," he insisted, his voice laced with a confidence I knew was misplaced. "I'll text you when we get home." "Okay," I conceded, my voice filled with a reluctant resignation. "I'll be waiting for it." I waved my phone at him, a visual reminder of my expectation. They left. I watched them walk out of the pub, their figures disappearing into the night, and a sense of unease settled over me. I lingered at the bar, mingling with other patrons, attempting to distract myself from the growing anxiety that gnawed at my gut. 30 minutes passed, then an hour, still no text. The initial concern had morphed into a full-blown panic. I tried to rationalize, to convince myself that they were fine, that they had simply forgotten to text. But the nagging voice of doubt, fueled by alcohol and a premonition of disaster, grew louder with each passing minute. Then my phone vibrated. It was Sarah, calling. My heart leaped into my throat. I answered the call, my hand trembling, my voice already forming the words, "Took you guys long enough." But before I could utter the sarcastic greeting, Sarah's voice, hysterical, frantic, shattered the fragile composure I had managed to maintain. He's we," she stammered, her words choked by sobs, her voice barely audible above the background noise. I struggled to make sense of her fragmented sentences, my mind racing, my fear escalating with each unintelligible word. Calm down," I pleaded, my voice a desperate whisper. "What's going on?" "We got into an accident," she finally managed to say, her voice cracking with emotion. My heart sank. The knot in my stomach tightened, constricting my breath. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a physical manifestation of the dread that consumed me. "Oh, how bad is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is Thomas hurt? Are the police there?" Then, the words that would forever be etched in my memory, the words that would shatter my reality, came screaming through the phone. "He's not waking up. I think he's dead." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My knees buckled, and I felt myself collapsing, the phone slipping from my grasp. I was vaguely aware of people staring at me, their faces blurred, their voices distant and muffled. Sarah continued to scream, her voice a desperate, agonizing wail. She said something about seeing police cars approaching, and then the line went dead. I was in shock, pure, unadulterated shock. My mind couldn't process what I had just heard. It felt like a nightmare, a cruel, twisted joke. Thomas, dead? Couldn't be true. Simply couldn't be. I tried to call Sarah back, again and again, my fingers fumbling with the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But there was no answer. Each unanswered call fueled the growing sense of despair, the crushing weight of reality. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I thought I would vomit. I stumbled towards the bathroom, my legs unsteady, my vision blurred. I reached the sink just in time, retching violently, my body convulsing with the force of my grief and fear. I looked at myself in the mirror, my face pale and drawn, my eyes red-rimmed and swollen. The reflection staring back at me was a stranger, a haunted, broken version of myself. And then the anger came. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over me, consuming me entirely. It was an anger directed at myself, at Thomas, at the universe, at the sheer unfairness of it all. I started punching the walls of the bathroom, my fists connecting with the hard, unforgiving surface, the pain a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil that raged within me. I screamed, a primal, guttural sound that echoed through the small, enclosed space. I sank to the floor, my body racked with sobs, my mind reeling from the events of the past few minutes. I felt utterly lost, adrift in a sea of grief and despair. "It's all my fault," I thought, the words repeating in my mind like a broken record. "If only I had taken his keys. If only I hadn't asked him to hang out. If only. The guilt was overwhelming, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate me. I felt responsible, complicit in this tragedy. I sat there, on the cold, hard floor of the bathroom, for what felt like an eternity, lost in my grief, my guilt, my despair. Then, slowly, painstakingly, I pulled myself together. I wiped the tears from my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to regain some semblance of composure. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't face the pitying glances, the well-meaning but ultimately empty condolences of strangers. I needed to leave, to escape this place, this scene of my devastating loss. I left the bathroom, my legs still unsteady, my mind still reeling. I walked back towards our table, my eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, searching for something. I didn't know what, and then I saw them, Thomas and Sarah, standing by our table, holding their shot glasses, saying, come on, hurry up." I froze. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was as if time had rewound, as if the past hour, the agonizing phone call, the crushing grief, the overwhelming guilt had never happened. It was a glitch, a break in reality, a moment of utter, unexplainable surrealism. I didn't know what to do, what to say. I felt like I was trapped in a dream, a bizarre, twisted version of reality. Thomas looked at me, his expression a mixture of concern and amusement. "You don't look too good," he said, his voice slurring slightly. I grabbed him, my hands gripping his arms with a desperate urgency. I started babbling, my words jumbled, incoherent, a frantic attempt to explain what I had just experienced. He laughed, dismissing my frantic rambling as the product of too much alcohol. "Maybe you don't need another one of these," he said, gesturing towards the shot glasses. I let out the biggest sigh of relief, a sound that was both a release of tension and an expression of utter bewilderment. Tears welled up in my eyes again, but this time, they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of sheer, unadulterated disbelief. I was so confused, so disoriented, yet so incredibly relieved. It was the same feeling you get when you awaken from a terrible nightmare. The moment of clarity when you realize that the horrors you just experienced were not real, that you are safe, that you are alive. I sat there, speechless, for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Thomas and Sarah took their shots, and then Thomas grabbed his car keys. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. I felt like I was reliving the events of the past hour, trapped in a cruel, twisted loop. "Thomas, wait," I exclaimed, my voice rising in panic. "How are you getting home?" He replied with the same nonchalance as before. "I'm just going to drive. We live only 5 minutes away." I felt the blood drain from my face. The terror, the dread, the overwhelming sense of impending doom returned, washing over me like a tidal wave. "No!" I yelled, my voice filled with a desperate urgency. "Give me your keys. I'm paying for your cab home." He looked at me, puzzled, confused by my sudden outburst. "What's your deal?" he asked. "It's all good. No, trust me." I insisted, my voice trembling. "It's not a good idea." I pulled cash out of my wallet, thrusting it towards him. "Here, take it. I'll drive you back to the pub in the morning to get your car." He hesitated for a moment. Then, with a shrug, he relented. "All right, thanks, man," he said. "That is probably for the best." I remember watching them leave, feeling a mixture of relief and profound confusion. I yelled across the bar, a desperate plea, "Message me when you get home." I waved my phone in the air, a visual reminder of my request. Sarah waved goodbye, and Thomas just smiled, their figures disappearing into the night. I sat at my table, my head in my hands, for what felt like an eternity. The pub, once a place of lively camaraderie, now felt cold and empty. The sounds of laughter and conversation faded into a distant hum, a meaningless backdrop to the turmoil that raged within me. Then my phone buzzed. It was Thomas. "Thanks for the cab," the message read. I'm home, worried about how hungover I'm going to be in the morning. An intense wave of relief washed over me, lifting the weight that had been crushing me for what felt like an eternity. I finally called my own cab, eager to escape this place, this scene of my near miss with tragedy. For days, weeks, even months afterward, everything felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow stepped outside of reality, that I had experienced something that defied logic, that challenged the very foundations of my understanding of the world. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it a premonition? A glimpse into a parallel universe? A second chance? Or was it simply a bizarre, alcohol-fueled hallucination? A product of my own anxieties and fears? I considered seeking professional help, talking to a therapist, a psychiatrist, someone who might be able to offer some explanation, some semblance of understanding. But the fear of ridicule, of being dismissed as crazy, held me back. I decided to keep it to myself, to bury the experience deep within the recesses of my mind, to try to forget it ever happened. But the memory, the sheer, unexplainable strangeness of it, persisted. It lingered, like a ghost, haunting my waking thoughts and invading my dreams. It has been years since that night. The details have become blurred, the edges softened by time. But the core of the experience, the sense of unreality, the chilling premonition of disaster, the overwhelming relief of a second chance, it all remains, etched in my memory, a constant reminder of the fragility of reality, the mysteries that lie beyond our comprehension. And so, I am left with this story, this anomaly, this glitch in time. I don't know what it means, what it signifies, but I know it happened. And I know that, in some inexplicable way, it changed me. It made me question the nature of reality, the boundaries of perception, the limits of human understanding. And it left me with a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that perhaps the world is not as solid, as predictable as we believe it to be. Perhaps there are forces at play, unseen, unknown, that can, on occasion, disrupt the fabric of our reality, offering us glimpses into a world beyond our comprehension. A world where time can bend, where fate can be altered, and where the line between reality and illusion can become terrifyingly blurred.